Okay, well, Cadell, it's an absolute honor to welcome you to the podcast. I've been spending the last few weeks reading your book, Real Speculations, Thought Foundations, Drive Myths, and Social Analysis. And I've really appreciated that. I thoroughly recommend it. Very, very powerful work, really educational, and was really helpful for me to further feel into and concretize some of what has drawn our shared interests into focus. It makes sense to me from yet another angle why we've been in dialogue with each other over these last 4.5 years or so now. But it's curious, because I want this conversation to be relevant to a wide network, really. Lots of people who will be listening to this are familiar with your thinking. I've just listened to an awesome series of 8 or 9 conversations you had with OG Rose, which I thoroughly recommend, and we'll put a link to in the show notes. And this book there's so much to it that we really would need 15 conversations to address everything in there. And so in planning for this, I was thinking, what would be most valuable to journey with together? I am going to ask you to, in a moment, respond to a question, and then there'll be a few more that will, I hope, give you the opportunity to speak to and structure some of the core patterns of thinking and contributions you wanted to make with the book as a whole. But also, I'd love to use that as a basis to move towards areas of living question I have and some places of uncertainty around whether or not I am holding some concepts in the right way and where some of the edges for you might be in your current thinking process and building process and project of philosophy in the world. And so in that sense, it'd be awesome if this could open into something could potentially make a generative contribution to the understanding among the networks that we participate in. Maybe that's too lofty an effort, but somewhere in there, is where I'd love to try and thread the needle. So not to recapitulate too much territory, but at the same time, provide a really foundational basis, because I think the way that you've structured this book and the way that you are locating your thinking in the recent history of thought over the last 500 to 600 years is tremendously generative and a really, well, as you put, a really, really vital thought foundation. So, and as well, before I open with this question, just to share with you, after reading and engaging with this work, there was something which came through that I think is probably how I would probably frame or locate our closest point of resonance in a very deep way, relates to the living word. Yeah, the living word. Where is and how can we support the conditions for the living word to presence today? That question is what I felt like you and I have been circling around. And there's a way that you give a phrasing of what you mean by the living word in the book, which is a truth that needs you just as much as you need it. And of course, there's lots more context that could be said in relation there. So I just wanted to share that as a place of, a potential axis around which I find a place of collaborative connection. So anyway, with that said, one of the core threads in the work relates to the notion of the theopolitical. And so I'd like to ask you to explicate the meaning of the theopolitical in relation to the modern progression of online popular discourse. You discuss that in the opening of the book, particularly with respect to Jordan Peterson, Sam Harris, Richard Dawkins, and how you conceptualize Philosophy Portal, and also networks like Voicecraft and the broader liminal web. You're situating the project of your philosophical thought and collaborative effort in the world in relation to the broader intellectual milieu and sort of cultural participation in the kind of thinking that we get from Jordan Peterson, Sam Harris, Richard Dawkins, and so on. And the thread of the theopolitical there, I think, does become really core to the book. And you don't immediately bring that out in the preface, but I'm sort of just asking you to share a little bit about what the theopolitical means, why that matters, and how that concept came to develop in the book, given the basis of thinking that you open it with, this analysis of the relationship between Peterson, Dawkins, and Sam Harris.
Yeah, that's great. And I like the general spirit there that you're approaching real speculations and many of the threads that you were presencing there in your opening. I hope we can get to most of that in this podcast. And in general, I just appreciate you having taken the time to really read the book and digest the book. It means a lot. So in terms of specifically the theopolitical, I think that perhaps you'll agree, my reading of our current moment is that all of the narratives, conscious and unconscious, about liberal democracy are breaking down. The coherence and the validity and the justification of these narratives, it just seems like nobody is really content with the status quo of basically the political liberal order that we've in many ways grown up within. And why is that? Why is it breaking down? And in the crack of it breaking down, what do we see there? You know, there's a lot of communities that I'm interacting with that talk about post-liberalism is a term that keeps coming up. Post-liberalism. How do we get beyond liberalism? When I think about the discourses that I see around post-liberalism, usually what I see is sub-liberalism, meaning a regression to something pre or illiberal, not actual going beyond liberalism to something higher. Right? So that I think the theopolitical challenge is there actually. And why is that? Well, if we go back to the birth of liberal democracy, we're really going back to the main signifiers that we connect to what we say the modern world. When we think about the American Revolution, so we can put historical events here. When we think about the American Revolution, or when we think about the French Revolution, what were these revolutions? These revolutions were not only the birth of political modernity, right, which was kind of the culmination of scientific modernity and artistic modernity and literary and humanities breakthroughs in the previous centuries, which didn't reach their fullness until political modernity, right? Because it's like you're operating within still a monarchical society. You're still operating within a dogmatic religious society when you have these breakthroughs in science and art and literature and the humanities, right? What we call the Renaissance and the scientific revolution, right? But then with the American and the French revolutions, you reach political modernity. And one of the main distinctions in political modernity is the separation of church and state, the separation of the theological and the political, right? There's this idea, and liberalism is literally, and I talk about that in the opening chapter, like that modern politics is, and liberal democracy is also a reaction against monarchy and dogmatic religiosity. And those two things go together. We know that from the history of European history. What we have the divine right of kings, right? That you get the monarchical justification for that political social order, and you get the certain religious metaphysics which leads to the reification of a certain political order. These things were connected. The theopolitical was connected, right? So when we have the breakdown of liberal democracy, I think what we're having the breakdown of is the question of, can these things be separated, actually? Or do we need to think them together in a new way? And if we think them together in a new way, the theopolitical, well, you're opening up a big can of worms. Well, how do we think the theopolitical? That's huge. Now, that's a massive challenge. And I don't think our culture has really been consciously reflective of how deep that challenge is. So when I use the figures of Richard Dawkins and Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson, what I'm trying to do is explore from my perspective how that conversation is bubbling to the surface, but it's bubbling to the surface in a very unconscious way, right? So, I want to start by saying that all this work I'm building up towards in Real Speculations, what's alive for me in my current work, which is just ongoing right now, is, of course, I'm teaching the early Marx course, so getting deeper into Marxism. And Marxism itself was a symptom of liberal democracy, right? Marxism actually was that attempt to go higher than liberalism, right? But it just failed so horribly, right? So we don't want to touch that. We don't want to go back there. We don't really actually understand what went wrong there. Like, first we have to understand what was the impulse there. Like, why was that attractive? Like, it was attractive. Like, the working class was attracted to it. But then you get burned by it, right? And then you say, oh, well, how do I can't go back there now, right? So this is kind of like where I'm thinking about the theopolitical, and there's lots of articles about this, about how, and a lot of people, critics and fans alike, who talk about how, the communist states were unconsciously religious, right? So again, is even in Marxism, which is stereotyped as atheistic, the religious dimension appeared within it. So there's a whole topic here about the theopolitical that we don't know how to talk about, right? So again, going back to the Dawkins, the Harris, and the Peterson thing, and then I'll try and set up what that means for what I'm trying to get at with this topic is, Marx starts the Critique of the Philosophy of Right, one of his earliest first works, by saying that the critique of religion is the beginning of the critique of politics, right? So Marx is saying, if you start critiquing religion, and of course this is coming from the French Revolution, the American Revolution, right? So you critique religion, you keep critique, and eventually you come to actually the critique of the social body. You come to the critique of politics. And so I think that's a whole topic, but in Real Speculations, I'm opening the book with the dialecticization of new atheism, because I think for the 21st century, that is actually the beginning of our society's critique of religion, or re-critique of religion, right? Like, that's where I was coming up in. When I was 19, I was reading Richard Dawkins, I was reading The New Atheists, right? And I was thoroughly convinced by their critique of religion. Now, that whole movement has fizzled out. But why has it fizzled out? Right? Why has it fizzled out? With someone like Richard Dawkins, and you can see this today, and I don't make a straw man of Richard Dawkins, I have a tremendous respect for Richard Dawkins. But if you see his contemporary conversations, he still has a presupposition that liberal democracy and scientific rationalism and Renaissance humanism can be the foundations for a social order. Like, that we can critique religion out of existence. Fundamentally, like, we could maybe keep some sort of superficial aesthetic dimension to it, but that fundamentally we can move away from a real belief in religion, and that we can have just a liberal democracy, humanist rationalism, scientific materialism. Right? So from my point of view, what we're seeing there in the reprocessing of this challenge is a critique of religion in atheism, which does not take up the critique of politics, right? So I want to emphasize that. We have a critique of religion, but we have a failure to then move from that critique of religion to the critique of politics. And, the unconscious is super intelligent. So what I'm trying to do is pick up the way in which our collective unconscious is very aware of this failure. So for transparency, and I get into this in the book, I basically have been using the structure of Hegel's phenomenology in thinking about these things. Right. So, and then the first chapter and the second chapter and things like that, I get into that, into how I think, or what is that phenomenological structure, basically. But the way I've been thinking about it is you have consciousness, self-consciousness, reason, spirit, religion, absolute knowing. Now, consciousness and self-consciousness, it's hard to historically get away from those categories because they're just so fundamentally what we are. We're born a consciousness and we develop a self-consciousness, and then we come into reason. Now, someone like Richard Dawkins is thinking we can just use reason to get rid of spirit and religion. And that we can just, it's as if he jumps from reason straight to absolute knowing. Hegel calls that premature ejaculation. Something like, it's like you're skipping there. It's like you're cheating there. I know. So the person who's very rational, it's like they can see absolute knowing. And it's like they can see spirit and religion in the way, as it were. Like, can we just get beyond that? Like, and there is a part of me that I get that. So I want to say, like, existentially, on some level, I'm sympathetic to Richard Dawkins doing that. Like, because there is even, like, at Wake Festival with Peter Rollins, there were some people who are like ex-evangelicals, like they're deconstructed Christians. And they're saying to me, like, do we really need to do this religion thing still? And I'm like, yeah, I know. I was like, I know it's a bit ridiculous, isn't it? But apparently I think we do, is basically, and I'm saying I'm coming to this conclusion against my desire. Right? Like, this is not my desire. Like, if it was up to me, we wouldn't have to, like, I'm like, there is a part of me that, like, and a long time wrestling before I did the Christian atheism course. Like, I was like, do I really have to do this? It's like, is this really what's going on? It's like, and it seems like it is. So I'm like, okay, I have to go against my desire here. Like, but anyway, you see this with Richard Dawkins. In the New Atheist movement, it breaks to Sam Harris with the spirituality thing. Right? So he does the waking up, right? I remember reading Waking Up, and then he does the podcast, then he does the app. And in his current podcast today, like, again, it's not a straw man, he still does the Waking Up community. Like, the podcast app is still the Waking Up podcast, and it's still the same community. So it's kind of as if Sam Harris is saying in that Waking Up book, which is that I engage mainly with the God delusion, then the Waking Up book with Sam Harris, and then the Maps of Meaning with Jordan Peterson. So I'm engaging their actual work, right? So with Sam Harris in the Waking Up book, he's kind of saying, yes, there's a limit to reason. There's a lack in reason. And what we find in spirituality, we have meditation, we have psychedelics, we have this experience of transcendental love, right? Literally, like the experience of transcendental love, that's in spirit, which is not rational, right? But then the weird thing in that Sam Harris moment, and he breaks from New Atheism. Like, he says, I don't even really identify with the signifier New Atheism. Sam Harris even kind of says it's more of a publishing phenomenon, and I was a part of that Four Horsemen thing, but now I'm moving on to the spirituality. But then, interestingly, like, as soon as Jordan Peterson, like a rocket, explodes into the intellectual conversation and in a global way, his first conflict is with Sam Harris. His first substantive conflict is with Sam Harris. And it's about what? It's about truth on the level of spirit and religion. So to me, I can't make this stuff up. Like, to me, the unconscious is more intelligent. Like, it's trying to think this, right? It's like, you need to think this. And the interesting thing is that in all of these breaks, there's huge resistance to approaching this, right? Like there's huge resistance in those conversations between Harris and Peterson to bring religion and religious truth to the forefront of the conversation, as it were. But as I've seen, that's kind of what's been going on, right? So I'm just following what's been going on, and like then you follow what's downstream of Jordan Peterson. Now, Jordan Peterson famously, his position in all of this, in my reading, is that he is critiquing woke politics for being an unconscious religiosity, right? So again, the theopolitical, right? Woke politics as an unconscious religiosity, the new religion of liberalism, right? And he's offering a secular doorway into thinking about religion, because he's saying oh, look, guys, it's just the psychological significance of religion. It's just that it's psychologically significant. It's not like, don't worry, like it's not ontologically true. It's just psychologically significant, right? So we need these maps of meaning, right? And so he gets into maps of meaning. And he gets into how religion functions as these maps of meaning throughout the book. Now, what's interesting, and then downstream of Jordan Peterson, you have people who are like saying, no, Jordan Peterson's not Christian enough. He needs to be more Christian. It's not going deep enough, right? So you follow that downstream, and you find the people going, and they're going back to traditional Catholicism, or they're going back to Orthodox Christianity. They want like the real thing, so to speak. They want the real Christianity. This is the foundation for everything. This is the foundation for everything because this comes before liberal humanism. This comes before scientific revolution. This comes before the American and the French revolutions. So we want that, right? This comes before capitalism. We want that, right? So that's here now. I think that's like where we are kind of now. But from my perspective, again, going back to the idea, the critique of religion leads to the critique of politics, that again, and not a straw man, when you study Dawkins, Harris, Peterson in their living discourse, they do not take up the critique of politics. They don't take it up. Like, and it's remarkable, the way in which that leads to these crucial deadlocks. And like, I'll just say one final thing before throwing it back to you about what all this means and like how I think about this. What is the straw man that Peterson constructs? It's socialism. The way Peterson talks about socialism is a straw man. When what socialism as a signifier means to Peterson is not what socialism is. It's not. If you go into the actual historical literature and the actual history of the origin of socialism and what it's about, that is not what Peterson is meaning. What Peterson sees as socialism is wokeism. But wokeism is not socialism. It's an extremely confused, an extremely diluted version of socialism. It is in that lineage, which we need to think, and that's a challenge for us. But, for example, in Maps of Meaning, he opens that book by saying that he was a young man. When he was a young man, he was a socialist. And then he said he fell out of socialism because he didn't want to become resentful. Right? Fair enough. Fair enough. Really fair enough. Then at his recent Oxford Union talk, which is just last month, he just had this Oxford Union talk. And he was asked at the end of this long Q&A with students, where there was also a trans question that came up where he just completely loses his mind. Like completely loses, like just completely unhinged. Right? But then at the end of the Oxford Union, the moderator asks him, what is the main mistake you made in your intellectual career? And he said, when I was 14, I was a socialist. As a joke, right? But there's truth in that joke, right? Like the challenge before us, and of course, what is the straw man that is? It says postmodern neo-Marxism. Postmodern neo-Marxism, that's the problem. But now the weird, I think, Hegelian cunning of reason that's coming with Peterson now is he scapegoats postmodernism, right? Postmodernism is the problem. Now, downstream of Peterson, with the people going into the traditional Catholicism and Orthodox Christianity, they're scapegoating modernism, right? Peterson scapegoats postmodernism. Now, downstream of Peterson, you have people scapegoating modernism. It's like, oh, you thought postmodernism was the problem. No, 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 no. Modernism is the problem. We need to go back. We need to go back. So there is always this tendency of thought to go back. Why? Because to go forward, you have to think through some really heavy stuff. Like, you got to think through some really heavy stuff. Like, how many people are really thinking about what the problems of the French Revolution were? How many people are thinking about what the problems of the Russian Revolution were? No one. Hardly anyone. But these problems are still with us. When you have someone who's saying we should replace liberal democracy with monarchy, that's someone who doesn't want to think what the problems of the French Revolution were. When you have someone who says we just have to live with free market capitalism, we can't have socialism, that's someone who's not willing to think what the problems of the French Revolution were. No one is saying these revolutions were perfect. No one is saying these revolutions were just straightforward in a sort of identitarian sense, the right move. But they represent absolutely central contradictions of our political body, the social substance of our political body, which we don't want to think. We don't want to think. We don't want to go there. We'd rather go back. So real speculation is, and I pass it back to you, real speculations is taking up that challenge. It's saying, no, we have to go forward, but in order to go forward, we have to actually understand and process the history of modernity and the history of postmodernity. And we need to really do that. We need to sink our teeth into that. And we need to connect that with what's actually happening in our networks.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you, Cadell. That was brilliant. There's a few things toward the end there which I'd love to ask for more clarification about, but I think it might take us a little bit slightly too off track relative to the threads I want to bring in here. For instance, I'm curious, basically tracking you and with you, and I think you're being fair the whole way. And then I would just question what concretely you're seeing in terms of the, let's say, the Christian/religious context, then going back and pointing out particularly about the modernist context that's a problem. I see that, but I'm just wondering what you have concretely in mind. So I'll just leave that there and perhaps you can weave it in. But as we, and for those of you listening, I'm hoping you stay with this over the whole length of the conversation, maybe listen to it in parts, because I want to spend still the next sort of 20 to 40 minutes building out some of the context of the understanding that's going to be present in the dialogue here. Because there's another key line of thought foundation that you bring to making sense of all of this. And to begin to presence that, I think it would be really helpful if you could speak about the importance of Immanuel Kant's philosophy and the Kantian turn, but then importantly and critically, the Hegelian response to Kant. So could you speak to why these are so important, these turns, for grounding how we think about everything you just said from a philosophical perspective?
Absolutely. So the first thing I want to presence is, in the same way that the theopolitical is a huge challenge, it's just tremendous. I think an equally difficult challenge is the relationship between, well, there's two. There's the relationship between the theological and the philosophical, and there's the relationship between the political and the philosophical. I'm even thinking that this is kind of a triad between the theological, the philosophical, and the political. And they're all connected. They're all connected in strange ways, in ways that are probably mysterious to everyone almost. But the political revolutions that I was referring to, of the American Revolution and the French Revolution, that is the social context in which Immanuel Kant was writing. Okay, so when Kant is developing his philosophy, it's not irrelevant that Kant is writing in this social context. That's what he's thinking about. Like, so when we think about Kant's philosophy, which can oftentimes be very difficult to get at, what is he talking about? And why is it so important? The critique of pure reason, right? And even if you take the title, the critique of pure reason, and you really think about it, right? It is actually the kernel of what Kant's trying to do. Basically, when we think about the American and the French revolutions, probably what most people would spontaneously affirm about it is that there's an important move there with the forwarding of the liberal individual and the importance of the individual, right? You can also catch this as like the scapegoating of the individual today, right? Like, people think individual is the problem. Of course, there's a form of individualism that's the problem, but you have to realize the context of the American French Revolution. Individualism wasn't the problem. Individualism was what we were fighting for. We fought for that, right? What are the historical consequences of fighting for that? We've got the civil rights, right? And human rights. Right now in British Parliament, human rights are collapsing. Right now in British Parliament, the issue is human rights. Like, that's what we're going to have to sacrifice, right? But we fought for that. We fought for civil rights, we fought for human rights, and all the expanded categories there of women's suffrage, of abolition of slavery, of racial equality, right? All of that is coming out of these revolutions.
Could I just add one tiny thing in here? Just
Sure.
because I think it'll be helpful. Effectively, and this was one of the notes I took in reading your work, if I was to reduce the importance of thinking the meaning of the theopolitical, it could come through in the question, what's worth fighting for? And I do think that question is permeating global conversation at the moment. And what you're articulating here is the history of various things that we have fought for, but have not been able to integrate and remember in conversation without becoming fractured and lost. So please continue.
Absolutely. I mean, we fight for something. In the moment we're fighting for it, we know we need to win this, but then once it's won, we forget. And here's another thing. We always utopianize what we're fighting for. And then when we get it, it's not a utopia. So then we forget, well, why did we fight for it? Maybe it was better to go back, right? So you think, oh, it's going to be a utopia when we have individual rights. Everything will be great. But then you get it and you're like, it's not a utopia. And actually what you experience is, wait, there's all new problems, right? Now, the challenge is that why philosophy is eternal and why philosophy is always needed is because there's always new problems, right? The challenge is thinking through the new problems, right? Which just is very difficult to do, right? The problem is that we need to become worthy of what has been won in individualism, right? There's a huge responsibility that does come with individualism, right? And if we don't take up that responsibility, well, then you do get kind of like a liberal hedonism, don't you? Right? Because if you win individualism, but then you don't take responsibility for yourself, well, then you just become a hedonistic person, right? So yeah, I mean, then and then a religious dogmatist will come in and say, "Well, I told you, you can't do it without God. I told you, you're just a hedonist, right? You're going against God. You're just a sinner. You gotta go back." Right? So it's really deep in that way. So I'm saying all of that to presence what is Kant's philosophy about. Kant's philosophy, he uses terms like subjective a priori. He uses terms like transcendentalism, the transcendental categories of reason. So you have, then I won't put out too many of these concepts, but when we take subjective a priori, or when we take the transcendental categories of reason, what is Kant trying to say there? What Kant's trying to say there, and what the break he represents in philosophy is that most, if not all, previous philosophers had some sort of idea of the universal being. A universal being, in principle, that exists without subjectivity. Some objectivity, which is universal, which our cognition can attune itself to, can cultivate itself to be worthy of, right? To cultivate itself so that I can think the forms, the universal forms of Plato, or that I can think being in the Parmenidean sense, the one, the unmovable one, or Aristotle's first cause, the prime mover, the unmoved mover, right? Or Spinoza's nature, right? Nature as God. And I know there's complexities here, right? But I'm just trying to point at that before Kant, there is these ideas that philosophers are ultimately doing is thinking this universal something. Fill in the blank. It's basically God. It's basically the philosopher's God, right? What Kant is doing is saying that all of these philosophical positings are forgetting the subjective a priori, that these are all being posited by a subject, right? So Plato's universal forms for Kant saying, you posit that. You can't get out of that you're subjectively positing that, right? Or same thing for Aristotle, same thing for Spinoza, same thing for the list goes on. There's a subjective a priori. And he's saying that what you're positing is pure reason. It's just your pure rationality. Whether it has an actual external correlation, Kant says we don't know. We don't know. He calls that noumenal. We don't know. In relationship to phenomenal. Right? And so he's saying in many ways that you're closing the gap between the phenomenal and the noumenal with your pure reason. And then you're telling other subjects that they need to cultivate themselves into that understanding, which is your understanding. So Kant is asking, what are the transcendental categories? What are the fundamental categories that the human mind is structured by, basically? And by the way, modern cognitive science is Kantian. Modern cognitive science also thinks this. Modern cognitive science says No, the categories are internal. Like, for example, space and time, right? Like Kant is really responding to Newton, by the way, on a scientific level. When Newton is saying the absolute space and time external to us, again, Kant is saying that's a subjective a priori. You're saying that, Newton. Kant is saying the categories of space and time are fundamental to the way we phenomenally perceive things. They might not have anything to do with the noumenal. And in fact, modern quantum science seems to say pretty much the same thing. Modern quantum science is saying the noumenal is not related to space and time, really. Right? Like, what we get at in the noumenal of quantum science is, we don't need to go into it, but seems strange. Seems quite counterintuitive to the way in which we phenomenally perceive and understand the world. Superpositions and entanglement and all of these different dimensions which are not intuitive categories. I don't perceive you as a superposition of being. I don't perceive you as entangled with things in other areas of the universe, right? Beyond space and time, right? No, we perceive things in terms of space and time. So that's the Kantian revolution. He's basically trying to provide a philosophy that is not only adequate to modern science with the Newtonian breakthroughs, but he's trying to provide a philosophy that's adequate to the political revolutions. Because what becomes the subjective a priori for the pre-modern? It's the king. The king and the unified substance of the monarchy, and all the subjects are lower than the king. And the king has a birthright, which is different than your birthright, right? And that becomes reified by God. And Kant is saying, no, we need a philosophy that's adequate to the individual. And he actually says that's in his short text, which people should read, which is very understandable, which is called What is Enlightenment? Like Kant says in What is Enlightenment, he opens What is Enlightenment by reminding us that women too can think. Right? As if we need to remind ourselves of this, right? And when you listen to some of the discourse, which is presenting itself as post-liberal, but is actually illiberal, a lot of what's going on there is that, can women really think? Should women really be able to vote? Really? Right? Like, this is what Kant is reminding people at the opening of the book. What is enlightenment? He's saying, you know what he says? Use your own understanding. Use your own understanding, right? So what I'm saying there with the pre-Kantian philosophy is that Kant is saying pre-modern philosophy is trying to get you to adopt someone else's understanding, the other's understanding, Plato's understanding, Aristotle's understanding, Spinoza's understanding. Kant is saying, use your own goddamn understanding. It's not that dissimilar from someone like Terence McKenna saying, build your own goddamn boat. You know, and Terence McKenna is saying, build your own boat. There's something in McKenna saying that, which is Kantian. Is saying, use your own understanding, right? So that's what's being broken open with Kant. And then Hegel is really, I mean, definitely, like, for Hegel, Kant is the father. Like, it's true that Hegel is wrestling deeply with Plato, and Hegel is wrestling deeply with Aristotle. And by the way, I am not saying that we should not read Plato and Aristotle. We absolutely should read Plato and Aristotle. I'm just saying that there are these historical breaks in philosophy which happen from time to time. And when they happen, they retroactively change the way we think about the whole history of philosophy. What Hegel's really trying to take up is what he sees as lacking in Kant's philosophy, which is that he's basically saying, and then I'll stop, but this is basically what Hegel's saying to Kant. And for me, the absolute teacher on this is Zizek. But what Hegel is trying to say to Kant is, okay, Kant, you've limited our reason, right? He's saying to Kant, you critiqued pure reason and you limited it. You limited it so that subjectivity could be thought. And you limited it so that the historicity of subjectivity could be thought. But you still have this category of the noumenal, which is this we don't know what, outside of our phenomenal apperception. And you have this idea that the limitation of reason is kind of like a bitter pill to swallow. Like it's a negative thing. It in a certain way, it sucks. Like we can't have access to the transcendental forms. We can't have access to the universal being. Hegel says the very thing you're calling a limitation is not only positive, the actual place where we can think. A new philosophy can come. But this very limitation is the thing itself. That what you're saying is the negative from the thing itself is the thing itself. So what that means is practically, and this is what I try to remind myself constantly, is that where I feel limited, where I feel in a contradiction with myself, that's the thing itself. So, and it's positive, meaning that the most intimate, the most disturbing limitations, contradictions of my being is actually a gift. If I can see it as a gift. But in order to be able to see it as a gift and to be able to act as if it's a gift and to be able to live my life like it's a gift, well, that takes a lot of self-work. That's a high bar. And that is related to the theopolitical.
Awesome. Thank you. Yeah. Okay, so yeah, it's important to highlight the positive and emancipating and participatory and dynamic, cool to process, and to see philosophy as process, to see philosophy and the contribution of one's word as called for, in a sense, by the question of how to relate to what we know in ourselves, our phenomenality in that regard, and the beyond. There's also a way that you presence the relationship between Kant and Hegel, which I think is very important, which highlights the negativity or what can be felt as an even bigger challenge, an even more bitter pill to swallow than what you're saying here, Hegel is saying to Kant, which is that Kant is in opening up and inviting the individual to participate in understanding. He's creating this divide to the noumenal and saying that, well, it's kind of on us. There's a limitation in our nature that prevents us from participating or coming to know what he is postulating as beyond us, which you can feel in all sorts of charged positive ways. And of course, the consciousness of the time and still today remains charged by the image and the feeling and the knowing of, let's just call it a deeper connection, however momentary or however mythologized in the psyche. But that the even more bitter pill is that it's not just a limitation of our own perceptive capacity, but that actually that limitation or that crack, to use other language you speak to, is in reality as such, that we are in process with transformation. And I'm not going to say too much more because I think the importance of the retroactive making sense of history, that is part of the Hegelian philosophy, that in a sense we can only come to know the progression of history, we construct it looking backwards in a sense. It is curious because although that's held on the one hand, most of what we do is relate speculatively to the future. And it does seem to me that some people are more capable of saying helpful things about where we are than not. And that does help to locate us and orient our activity toward the future. And then we participate in the creation of history in that regard. And so there is sort of a tension there that maybe we can return to, slightly separate at this point. But it seems to me that highlighting that really profound negativity, that reality itself has a profound incompleteness. Of course, this is in opposition to how certain world religions hold the notion of, an absolute knowing in the sense of God and perfection and omnipotence and all of this, and that provides grounding and belonging and givens and all the rest of it. So that has to be accounted for in terms of the psychic context in which these ideas are related to. And I think that structures very important parts of your thinking in the book and is a continued point of return. And I think it's worth bringing in, and I'll ask you to re-explicate this to the degree you think is helpful. But as we just recapitulate the progression from, although there's maybe no need to bring in the relationship, let's say, between consciousness and self-consciousness, into reason, into religion, into spirit, and then absolute knowing. You've referenced Dawkins, reason, Sam Harris, spirit, Jordan Peterson, reminding us of the importance of religion, finding a place, remembering that how we relate to, let's say, universal principles is very important and often lacking in, let's say, pure spiritual vibesy cultures. The actual struggle and lack of capacity that's often present to relate with difference in the context of mediating the real is a core part of the book. But in terms of then how we relate to the lack in religion, and there's obviously a lot more that needs to be said there in terms of what is necessary to understand what I'm increasingly understanding you to mean by absolute knowing, it just seems fundamental that we have to reckon with what it means to really think about incompleteness and lack in reality as such, rather than just in the limitations of our understanding. So I'd love for you to sort of speak to that and furnish that out more from a conceptual point, because I think it's important to have that as part of our dialogical context.
All right. So where I want to start with that is, correct me if I'm wrong, by the way, but you were hosting an event at a psychedelic festival with maybe a culture that's more the spiritual vibesy culture.
Right. Yes. A few years ago.
Yes. And I think if I remember correctly at that event, what you were talking about, what you were presencing was the war with Russia and Ukraine and war in general.
Right.
So I want to use that as an example of exactly what we need to deepen So you've got the spiritual vibesy culture, which you're saying is not really capable of interfacing with difference. Maybe in their rhetoric, they would say that's, again, you know how Richard Dawkins, I said, there's going from reason to absolute knowing and just skipping spirit and religion? In a way, the spiritual vibesy culture is looking at religion and politics and just trying to bypass it to absolute knowing. Right? It's like, no. So that's what we have to do. Like in a spiritual vibe. So this is what I do. Like in a spiritual vibesy place, we have to presence the issues of religion and politics. Like, oh, you had a nice transcendental vision. Great. Now let's look at this. Right? And then in religious spaces, in like actual religious spaces, we have to presence the political, because they'll usually like they'll usually avoid the way in which the political can. I had this joke with a guy from the TLC, Paul Vanderklay's This Little Corner. He came to one of the events we were doing about Christianity and transition, and we were saying we're talking about Paul Vanderklay's concept of the metagelical, which is his way of trying to sublate evangelicalism, inclusive of Catholicism and Orthodoxy, which is the real core of the idea. We were talking about how Jordan Peterson's gospel series on the Daily Wire was metagelical in the sense that it was talking about talking about the gospels, but with Jews, Catholics, Orthodox, Protestant. It had everyone at the table to talk about the gospels. Metagelical. But they were all Daily Wire conservatives. Oh, the political. Oh, the political. Right?
Yeah.
So you've got the metagelical. Metagelical is an advance. But now the metagelical needs to, we're all Daily Wire conservatives. Oop, how'd that happen?
Yeah.
Right? So that's where we can't bypass these things. Right? Not if we're really looking for deep connection like you were presencing. So when Kant limits reason and Hegel says it's ontological. In other words, when Kant says we have a limitation of reason, we can't get at the thing in itself, and Hegel says, no, that very limitation is the thing in itself that we need to think. What am I saying there? Saying the cracks of the American, the French, the Russian Revolution, this is the thing in itself. This is the becoming of reality itself. We're part of the becoming of reality itself. That's how Marxism exists. Marxism couldn't have existed outside of the Hegelian milieu. Right? Because what Kant is really good for, Kant is fantastic for establishing a liberal democracy. Kant is the philosopher that you use to establish a liberal democracy, whether you are aware of it or not. Hegel pushes the bar without himself intervening into that process, but Marx picks it up. So what does that mean for, like, let's say the pure vibesy spiritual communities in this example? When we think about Trump's first and second presidency, no, we're thinking actually with the thing in itself. When we think about Brexit, when we think about contemporary parliamentary breakdown in the UK around immigration and the insane countercultural turn towards reform, that's the thing in itself. That is literally the becoming of reality itself. And if you're going to, and you also mentioned a hierarchy of future speculations, like certain people have more relevant things to say about the future, speculative futures than others.
Right.
Here's the challenge for us. Why bother learning all this 19th century philosophy? Because if you don't learn how to think historically dialectically, your capacity to speculate about the future is radically insufficient, impoverished. The whole capacity to think speculatively about the future, the point of dialectics is to improve your capacity to do that. So, for example, to be able to think, like, here's my question. How many people can think the unity of Trump and Sanders? How many people can think that the unity of Trump and Sanders is actually, that they're part of the same phenomena? Trump and Sanders are both repetitions of the breakdown of a certain order of normative state politics on both the left and the right. That the failure to think that means the symptom will repeat, right? So when Trump had his first election and then he was elected out, people thought, oh, that was just a blip. That won't happen again. We can just go on as if business as usual. No, it repeated. The same thing's happening with Sanders, right? With the Fighting Oligarchy tour now. You're like, oh, we can just pretend Sanders doesn't exist. We can just continue to forward our normal Democratic candidate. No, you just would keep repeating and do big tours around fighting. This is a crack that you're not willing to think. This is the becoming of reality, and it involves all of us. Right? So one final thing. You mentioned absolute knowing, and you mentioned, let's say, the nature of the absolute. How do we think the nature of the absolute in this way? Hegel in the Philosophy of Right has the concept of absolute world spirit. What is absolute world spirit? Honestly, at the end of the day, what it is kind of the endless conflict between nation states. That's kind of what. Now, we could go deeper into it, but that's kind of what Hegel's saying absolute world spirit is. It's the endless, ceaseless activity and conflict of all these different world historical social beings, with seemingly no higher resolution between them, meaning some sort of world state which would bring world peace, which Kant kind of had an idea that we would have world peace. Hegel's kind of saying things are a bit more negative than that, in a way. And of course, now Marx, we could say, like, is Marx right here? Like, Marx is kind of saying you have this endless war of states, but then there's a qualitatively different political order which is beyond states. Like, ultimately, like, world communism is in its full maturation for Marx. It's stateless, it's classless, right? It's beyond states, it's beyond class. And so then what for Marx is the case is that what are liberal democracies doing? Liberal democracies are state management of class difference. For Marx, that's what liberal democracy is. It's the state managing class difference, right? Like, so Elon Musk will invest a lot of money into the state, into the Trump presidency, in order to what? In order to defend his class position. And to continue doing what he wants to do with as little regulation as possible. Right? And whatever his vision for the future is, back to speculations about the future, whatever his vision for the future is, that's the best human future. Need not have a collective social, like, and also, like, when you think about, like, free market capitalists with their ideas about social politics, usually if you listen closely to them, what they're saying is everyone can be an entrepreneur. I'm an entrepreneur. I succeeded at being an entrepreneur. I'm doing great. Great.
It's one of the most ridiculous things that's currently being said as the only response from this type of person to the phenomenon of AI. Well, just use it to get ahead, so you
Exactly.
don't have to employ everybody. And
I don't know if you listened to the conversation between, I forget his name, but it was with Gary Stevenson on Diary of a CEO. There's this podcast where they're discussing, yeah. So there's this, you see it right there. You see it right there, where the guy who's in dialogue with Gary Stevenson, he's just saying, you know, I came from a working class or a middle class background, and now I'm a multi-millionaire, whatever, maybe a billionaire. And, you know, and Gary, you're just being a Debbie Downer. Like if someone's listening to you, they're never going to start a business, you know. And so, but the thing is that he's not wrong to, like, this entrepreneur guy. He's not wrong to say that there's great virtue in starting a small business. There is great virtue in starting a small business. Of course, there's great virtue in starting a small business. It's not the issue. The issue is that the virtue of starting a small business is not a social, political, universal vision. It's part of it. It's part of the puzzle, but it's not the whole picture. There needs to be a much more expansive notion of how politics handles the social body.
Yeah, absolutely. It's total madness. Like, absolutely ridiculous. Anyway, it would be very fun to continue down the line of that particular kind of madness.
Yeah.
You know, one of the beginnings to, let's just call it a chapter of writing I've been doing, is exploring the meaning of the statement that the truth of capitalism is unemployment. And in a sense, that's really just to point to and make connections in relation to building out and magnifying the alienating dynamics of capitalism, and specifically as manifested in the march toward artificial intelligence and automation and efficiency and all these sorts of things, that is totally exemplified in the arguments being made in that naive entrepreneurial response to what do we do with this predicament of AI, because it's basically, and this is where so much young male energy is going to, so much hustler energy that has so much capacity to build. It's just like, let's start an AI automation agency. Let's build a business where I will progressively destroy all my capacity to be in relationality with everyone apart from other people on the hierarchy of building AI automation businesses. And it's totally wild. And the promise is, start a business and employ people. But okay, so some people have to be the employees, right? But your advice is to start a business. So the employees are coming from somewhere, right? Okay. And then really what you want to do is continue to automate things and free up your time with more efficiency and what? Anyway, it's totally remarkable that is, but it's understandable that it's given such a pass because of such a strong desire to succeed and build a life, as a person, as a man. And the whole crypto thing is in a very similar category. It's totally remarkable that you have Donald Trump and that whole context making meme coins and just preying on absolute parasitism on young men with no money, like absolute parasitism. It's totally tragic, but
Absolutely.
It's also, anyway. So that's all that, and we can return to that on another occasion. I want to invite the inclusion of some more core dynamics of your thinking in Real Speculations. Now, before I do, I just want to tune in now. I've largely been sort of wanting to just help create some scaffolding for dialogue, and I just want to take a moment to check in with what's been present and sort of situate myself in relation. Presence, a couple things. There's one or two things. They're slightly slipping me. They will come back through. So I will just move it on then. One of the key features of your thinking as I see it, and something which I think offers a lot to the conversation in our circles. Certainly, I have found it really generative to grapple with, is a phrase that you use: drive before myth. Drive before myth. Now, of course, part of the subtitle of the book is Drive Myths. And we've covered some of the thought foundations. You speak about drive myths. So, without me saying any more here, how do you understand the meaning of drive? What's the core influence that is grounding your usage of that? And then why drive myth, that particular ordering?
So first, to communicate drive myths, Christ is not a Christian. Christ is not a Christian. Nietzsche is not a Nietzschean. Christ is a drive. Christ is a drive which becomes retroactively mythified. Nietzsche is a drive, what he calls the will to power, which becomes retroactively mythified by Nietzscheans. When we read myth, so let's go back. Jordan Peterson with the maps of meaning and the psychological significance of the biblical stories. What is he saying? He's saying that the cultivation of our minds can be enhanced with myth. And in his context, a specific kind of myth. The Christian myths, the biblical myths, which you too quickly dismissed as irrational, right? Or dogmatic. When I'm talking about drive myths, what I'm talking about is that the origin of myths are in people's drives. What myths are a collection of drives, right? Like if you look at the different biblical chapters, you'll find people's names. Matthew, Luke, Paul, right? The people's drives, they're writing out their lives, right? Now they become myths. Peterson is a myth, but it comes out of his drive, right? So they're inextricably linked. We don't need to drive and myth are connected. They're two sides of the same coin. They're both needed. But what I'm trying to get at with my readership and with the people I'm targeting this book towards is I'm trying to get people to say, okay, once you've understood the importance of myth, which is important, then you need to understand the importance of drive. If you don't understand the importance of drive and you only understand the importance of myth, you're never really going to be able to build your own damn boat or to drive your own damn ship, right? So, but they're linked. Like, for example, like, you know, as a parent to a child, you want to raise the child in a deep understanding of myth, ultimately so they can drive. So the myth is not an end in itself, is what I'm saying. The myth is not an end in itself. The myth serves a function, and it's towards cultivating your drive. Now, what is the myth mediating, cultivating? Psychoanalysis has an answer for this. We introduce a triad: demand, desire, drive. We'll say it's the 3 Ds. Demand, desire, drive. When a baby or infant is born, it's nothing but demand. And the demand is right. The demand is always right. In the first 6 months or the first year of a baby's life, everything the baby demands is right. Because it's completely impotent. It can't walk. It can't talk. It can't feed itself. It can't shit itself. It shits itself. Right? It's completely helpless. And how does it make demands? It makes demands through the only way it can do it. Crying and wailing and throwing tantrums. And then the mother has to be there at its beck and call. And from a Lacanian perspective, the mother is kind of a replacement for the placenta. Because the placenta was doing all that in the womb. But now you have the mother, right? The mother is like a surrogate placenta for a few years. Then you move to desire. You recognize that you're not just making claims for your immediate needs, but you actually have desires, the things you want, things you don't have but you want. You don't necessarily need them, but you want them for some inextricable reason, for some mysterious reason. A man cannot live by food and bread, by bread alone, right? A man cannot just live by basic needs, which is the problem with, well, I mean, we get into the capitalist dimension of that, but you cannot just live by basic your needs. We're creatures of desire. We want things. And those things, at least in the tradition that I follow, they're related to something you lack. Becoming aware of the shape of your desire. So let's put that to the side, the demand. Now, adults still make demands, right? The analyst suggests that the proper response to an adult demand is nothing. If you have someone come into your clinic and they make demands, how should you respond as an analyst? Should just be still. Silence. The person needs to reflect more and more on the infantile nature of the demand, then to be ready to investigate desire as what you're lacking, but you don't need. The sports car, the fancy job, the beautiful wife, whatever it is. People repress, and all of the psychoanalytic structures are about the structure of the mind, back to it's Kantian, the structure of the mind, not in relationship to space and time, but in relationship to desire, in relationship to the structure of lack. So you can repress your desire. You can foreclose your desire. You can disavow your desire. All of these different structures correspond to different clinical categories that we call neurosis, psychosis, and perversion. Right? Psychoanalysis is about moving from demand to being curious about the problematics of desire. And even historically, religion and myth is trying to teach us about this. It's trying to teach us about what we desire. Traditionally, what does the pre-Christian religion say about it? The pre-Christian religion in general is basically saying that what you desire is an impossible fusion with the absolute. You want to be one with the transcendental being. Now, Christ has a different answer. We can get into that. But the key thing I'm trying to say here is that for psychoanalysis, desire becomes drive. And how does that happen? How that happens is reflecting on the structure of lack, you come to realize that what you want is actually the space of the lack itself. Because when you get what you want in some unreflective immediacy, like when I was a teenager, I would always go to the mall to get the new sports jersey or the new N64 game or my new baseball glove. Whatever. Desire is itself not problematic. The thing is that you need that space of that gap and that lack so that you can keep desiring precisely. Because when you get it, it's no longer desire. You have it. So this is getting at intimating what the nature of the drive is. The nature of the drive is, it's not that you don't desire things. It's that you recognize that what you want is desire itself, which is not any of its particular objects. But that gets us closer to what Lacan means by object patia. Object patia is precisely not any of these objects. Object patia is the ineffable nature of desire itself, which is infinitely filled with different objects.
Yeah. So the ways that I structure a lot of my thinking about some of these dynamics, although I do think this way too, so I find that the distinction between having and being in the Eric Fromm sense is helpful to differentiate aspects of what we're speaking to here. There are some needs which can be satisfied by attaining the object that then allows, if it's something that we must consume, take beyond the boundary of our membrane into the membrane, because it's an internal need. I have a want for an external object, which then satisfies an internal need, drinking, food, these sorts of things. But there's, maybe say some other categories too, but there are some good examples. Then that's one kind of thing. And then there's being needs, which are more relational. And so the classic examples are you're seeking relationship with another, then to have them or to consume them or to possess them would be a modal confusion with respect to the realization or treatment or cultivation of that desire. And so to the degree that psychotherapy or psychoanalysis is valuable for society, and there's more to say about it than this, just at the level of subjectivity and know thyself and cultivating a relationship with oneself and experience and all of that. But it's valuable insofar as it helps people build relationships with other people in some kind of continuity, and can support, intergenerational transmission and how to navigate the various differences and the necessity of thinking our time, which is, of course, a core thread of your work. And we've had a conversation on the podcast before about novelty and lineage and the challenge of thinking that father-son, mother-daughter relationship. And one of the triads in the book, which comes through again, I've been writing about also, is this relationship between the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. And, it seems to be one of these. It's always interesting to me, the relationship between psychoanalysis or depth psychology and then metaphysics. And Hegel gives an interesting way to think about this, as we've discussed. But the way that the teachings of the Father are both essential, but then ultimately inadequate at a certain time is just a wild thing. And there's a tremendous amount of pain in that and confusion and difficulty to discern, when is that time? And how to mediate that is very, very challenging. And of course, how we're mediating that as a culture at the moment to bring in those angles is, of course, very much still in process, and we don't have satisfactory answers. And the successful male entrepreneurs, as we've discussed, are not providing a particularly good answer. But they will produce some sons who massively succeed, and then we'll have to relate with the various dynamics of attentionalism and mimesis and a whole bunch of things which will create very real and are creating very real dynamics to relate with. And so as much as there's a frustration that we're both sharing in relation to that kind of dynamic, I do consider it to be very much and very likely to be a very serious and ongoing, social force in our world for many, many decades, I would say. And we could speak about, again, that at many levels. But to bring it back to this relationship between psychoanalysis, depth psychology, metaphysics, the cultivation of drive, I'm going to try and share something which I hope is a fair reflection of your perspective and what you're naming that we should be wary of, which is the inadequacy of myth alone to indicate and enable our navigation of desire. That even if we move beyond this, well, not everything can just be attained and consumed like it was some object in this basic having mode sense I identified, which is in some sense a kind of PG version of some of this thinking, or PG kind of more important, but kind of beginnings to it. That the way that myths, if we're not careful, come to structure our perceptions and the narrativizations that we make about what it means to become as an identity, put us at risk of following something which is shielding us from reckoning with the way in which our energy and desire is actually meeting the world, in a sense that if we stay too long in particular myths of narrativization, we're in effect blinding ourselves to understanding why it is we can keep on coming undone or repeating various patterns. So there's definitely more to it. How is it that you would invite us to connect with an understanding of knowing the drive in ourselves as distinct from mythologizing about where we are in order to protect ourselves from potentially profoundly deep discomfort? I mean, there's obviously a benefit in that to some degree, but if that's a clear question, please take it away.
So there's a lot there. I'll start by saying, just to simplify to the utmost and to connect it, what I was saying previously is myth can be thought of as, in a way, the universe of desire, helping us in a way to navigate the universe of desire. You could argue, better or just different than psychoanalysis. Psychoanalysis we've learned a lot from it. It also has limitations for various reasons that we could get into. And there might be something to the fact that people are gravitating more towards religion than individual talk therapy, for example. So there's a way in which these myths do cultivate us into, again, a universe of desire. But you already alluded to, I'm paraphrasing you here, if we stay too long in a strong identification with a particular myth of narrativization, then we're blinding ourselves in a certain way. And I think that that's structurally exact. That's exactly true. So we could use the example of someone like Peterson and his process, where you could say that, and I do say in the opening chapter of the book, that in many ways, Peterson, one of the themes I've been saying is that in many ways, our intellectual milieu and the frontier of our intellectual discourse, it kind of ends with Kant instead of starting with Kant. In other words, they find themselves ultimately ending in a kind of Kantian universe instead of taking that as a starting point and working from there. We get the history of modern philosophy. In many ways, what that means is that much of our intellectual discourse remains in the universe of desire, in the universe of myth, whether that's the religious myths of Christianity or whether that's the modern political myths of liberal democracy, right? Like a lot of people relate to liberal democracy as the equivalent of a religion. Like, you can't take away human rights. You can't take away the vote. Like these are absolute, right? So there's a way in which, however, when we simply stay in this realm of desire and myth, and I think in the case of Peterson, his historical performance, and I think the popular opinion about his current performance is that he's blind in many ways, and that he's blinded himself. That if he was culturally perceptive in 2016, that same cultural perception has been undermined or lost in 2025. There's a way in which this is being produced by his own confusion in his own, like his latest book, Wrestling with God. He's basically wrestling with myth still, right? Like, and when he, for example, goes on the Joe Rogan podcast or when he's doing the art conference, what he's basically doing is he's just revealing his own sort of mythological foundation, which is something like the importance of Old Testament mythology for morality mixed with free market capitalism to avoid socialism. So we get stuck there. But you ask basically a question, it's how do we connect to the knowing drive? So I can use the way I've understood Christian myth and the way it points towards drive. And what lesson can we take from that? Because I'm not like a traditional or stereotypical Christian in any way. Like, I don't go to church. I've started to interact with more Christian communities, but they would see me as Christian. And let me connect it also to our previous conversation about novelty and lineage. What we talked about there is, so I'm going to talk about the Father, Son, Holy Spirit as how do we get to drive. You have the Father, Son relation, which opens into Holy Spirit in the Trinity. What we talked about in the novelty and lineage discussion was the gap between Father and Son growing, which is basically a metaphor for the gap between elder and child, or the gap between the generations. You know, you pointed towards the entrepreneurial culture going to be producing many sons. And at the same time, the fathers of the entrepreneurial culture basically saying, this is, follow this direction, right? This is how you succeed. The problem we are facing is that in previous modes of human history, the gap between father and son was relatively small to what it is now. Meaning that you could look at the father, or if you're a woman, you could look at the mother, just basic sense perception, and you could say, I want to do something like that. Or I will be doing something like that. Right? Like what my dad's doing when I grow up, I'll be doing something, if not exact, something similar. Same for the mother. Where we are is that gap's grown so big that when I look at my grandfather or when I look at my father, what they're doing is not relevant. It's not a meaningful map for me. It forces me, whether I like it or not, into the drive. Because the meaningful map or the myth doesn't basically work. The problem is all in the ethics of how we handle that gap. My hypothesis, working hypothesis, is in a culture which has a huge gap, the possibility to get lost, the possibility for exploitation, the possibility for abuse grows. I kind of have the working assumption that we live in a kind of perverted society. And I mean that structurally in the sense of perversion being a kind of libidinal enjoyment without any thought for reproduction. And reproduction in a very vast sense. Like not just biological reproduction, but also the way in which I spiritually can be a father for the next generation. Right? That like you look up, say, people who are 10 years or 20 years older than you in this field. You might look up to them and just say, well, is there a good direction there? Is that what I want to become, or do I want to become like that? Or maybe a little difference. I'll add a little like that, but a little difference. Right? Well, the guys who are 20 that look to us or look up to older figures the same way. So we're sons and fathers. Like we're sons and fathers at the same time, even if you don't reproduce. You know? So I'm thinking about it in a vast, expanded sense. The question is how to deal with both the reality and the importance, even the absoluteness to some degree of the Christian myth, and at the same time, its limitation and its going beyond itself. You know, someone like Jacob Kashir, who I think we both have a relation, he talks about Christianity beyond itself. Matt Segal, I think, also talks something like Christianity beyond itself. So in the spirit of that, and my sort of way of framing that is Christian atheism. So that's my way of framing Christianity beyond itself in a way. Maybe we're not saying the exact same thing, but there's something similar being intimated there. How to think about the Father. The idea would be we think about the Father not as a transcendental category which gets reified for all time, which you could argue that Peterson kind of has this view or performs this view. He performs the transcendental Father, or has a kind of notion of patriarchy in the Father, which is kind of a transcendental reification. This can appear in Marxism. The way in which people in the Soviet Union related to Stalin was as a transcendental father. The way in which people related to Mao in the Cultural Revolution was as a transcendental father. The way in which North Korea operates is definitely with a transcendental father, right? The key is going from the Father as a transcendental function to the Father as a self-vanishing. This is the key Christian atheist idea. God the Father is not transcendental Father. God the Father is self-vanishing. God vanishes, right? This is where we have death of God, right? Nietzsche, Jung talks about death of God. Nietzsche, right? God as self-vanishing. What this means, and Lacan talks about this on the level of the Father, what does the Freudian myth of the primordial Father mean? The sons want to kill the Father. right? In the primordial story of the Father. The sons want to kill the Father. Why do the sons want to kill the Father? Because the Father is the all-enjoying Father. He has all the women. He has all the power. He has a monopoly on violence. And he has all the food and all the resources. So that's why the sons want to kill the Father. They want to take the wealth that the Father has, or perceived wealth, let's be honest. In most cases, perceived wealth. Let's be honest about that. All the fantasy is all the women. The fantasy is all the violence. The fantasy is all the resources. The Father has them. And we can kill the Father and we can distribute it for ourselves. We can form an egalitarian community by distributing these resources. Right? That's the fantasy. That's the story. So the key thing for the self-vanishing Father is the sons want to kill you only insofar as that you're a subject of desire. So what does that mean? To step into being a father, you have had to process your own desire, and in many ways, you have had to overcome your own desire. Or you have to be careful with how much of your desire that you show. You have to be aware, attentive, that your son will view your desire as a threat. Why? Because you're bigger, because you're stronger, because you're more experienced, because you have ways of moving and ways of being that the son finds mysterious. Will that always be the case? No. The son will grow up. The son will be strong one day. The son will know how to move in his own way, eventually. Right? And of course, this gets recapitulated in the animal kingdom through the endless topplings of alpha chimpanzee males, right? Like endlessly. That's the fate. Like whenever there's the alpha chimp, it's only a matter of time. It's only a matter of time. And the same thing for humans. It's only a matter of time. So you want to get ahead of this. And the self-vanishing father is the way to do it. I would argue. Now, so you have the self-vanishing father. Now, what does that mean for the son? It means for the son in the Christian story, it's the crucifixion and resurrection. So what is the crucifixion? The crucifixion is that the son has lost the father. He says, Father, Father, why have you forsaken me? Father, why did you send me to this earth to be crucified? This is what you wanted for your son? Here we have to reflect on the pain of the father too. Right? Because if you have a son, literal son, eventually you can create a safe space for your son. You can hide your desire from your son. But eventually your son is going to have to face the world. And that is going to be a crucifixion. And guarding your son from that is not necessarily the best, right? Like this also the Buddha story gets at this, right? Like the Buddha story is also a kind of engagement with this, right? Now it has a different answer, but it's still the same, pointing at the same thing. So you have the crucifixion, but the crucifixion, paradoxically, if the son accepts the crucifixion, which Christ reluctantly does, reluctantly and then passionately, right? At first he's like, really? This is what you want from me? And then he's like, oh, fuck, okay. All right, I'll take it. Right? So then you have the crucifixion, and then that paradoxically leads to the resurrection. But what is the resurrection? The resurrection is in Holy Spirit, which is not only the lack of the Father, meaning there's no Father, but there's also no Son. It's the community, it's the network, it's the social effect. So what this means is it's leading to a higher form of social life, right? And the Christians make a claim here, a historical claim, by the way, that it's in relationship to Rome. It's claiming that the social substance of Rome is rotten. That's what it's saying. It's saying the Roman Empire is rotten to the core and literally usurps it. It says we need a different social substance. We need a different social way of being, which respects the link of father-son. And in the respect of the link of father-son, in the ethics of the self-vanishing father and the crucified son, we could have a different social substance. Now, how do we interpret that today? We're not under the Roman Empire. We're under the American Empire. We're under the techno-feudal empire. We're in a different empire, right? We don't believe in the transcendental function of God in the same way that we did. We find ourselves with a huge gap of problems of reproduction, problems of thinking about what is a modern father and mother. How do we think about elders today? How do we think about children today? How do we think about family today? These are all massively gaping questions for us, right? So I think, and then passing it back to you, that when we point towards Christianity beyond itself, or when we point towards something like a Christian atheism, what we're trying to do is kind of work through this. We're kind of trying to work through, okay, yes, Christianity is very important. It's clearly done something really, really crucial we need to understand. And at the same time, it needs to go beyond itself. And there's something in secular atheist culture that needs to be preserved, is important for plurality, for multiplicity, for diversity, for making sense of the global in its totality. Which that's kind of what we're struggling with, I think, at the moment.
That was awesome, Cadell. Really, really well articulated, mate. Fantastic. So, part of my initial prompt and question was wanting to ask for some more clarification about drive in specific. Now, I feel very connected to my drive, and I also am aware of at least some of the myths that have been structuring my endeavor, particularly as manifested in voicecraft and, let's call it, a broader philosophical life project in the world. And it's interesting the way you articulate there. I know you use the language of a vanishing mediator as well to describe this vanishing function of the father. And I really like your pointing to these dynamics. I wonder about the way to poeticize that function. In some of the myths, one particular image that structured very early on, 2017 or so, in some inner visioning work of literally working with prompts and image to conceptualize, not even to conceptualize, to pictorialize, to mythify the orientation toward building I was feeling and desiring, that, and in connection to an orientation toward, beauty and goodness and truth, was an image which saw me, and I won't go into all of it, but certainly part of it saw me as an old man leaving the door ajar, but very much, shutting the door. The door ajar is, I think, important to name, and then to step away toward the cliffs and look back at this beautiful house in which there's just a vibrancy of social life, family and community, and a real vitality of engagement with the living word to bring that back in. And so it's interesting how in that image there is that movement of, one could say, vanishing. It is interesting. Okay, so what's coming to me here? Other kinds of myths. These aren't ones I have subjected to like serious and ongoing conceptual mediation, but from the perspective of generativity, in Star Wars, what happens to some of the symbolic fathers is, yes, they do literally vanish, right? When Darth Vader uses the lightsaber on Obi-Wan, it's kind of literally vanish, but actually not entirely vanish. Actually does, in fact, remain in a very deep way present and takes his
has
place.
A spectral. Like
has a spectral.
You see him right after. He's a specter on the planet with the Ewoks.
Right.
Like he's there as a spectral apparition, redeemed in a certain way.
Right. And, and so you'll see, Qui-Gon and Yoda, and in the canon of Star Wars, you have, these great masters, and, they're just having chats into infinity, and they don't really take it any much further than that. I haven't read the books. This is just my understanding of the canon. So maybe, who knows what else goes on in terms of how these dynamics ultimately, they're going to find their way into being thought by the repetitions of kind of where we are still struggling as a society. And so many fantasies is very interesting. I like reading fantasy, and I find it extremely helpful for, or at least I'd narrativize this to myself, that fantasy from a young boy up until now provides a way, kind of enriches the experience of thinking categorical relations and multiple levels. And you have, gods and men and women and different dramas at this level, different dramas of that level, and they're influencing each other, and different kinds of, universals and perennials are thought and mythified with wild criticality that really brings emotion to understanding what's at stake in whatever the situation is. But it has always, from my perspective, it always seems to be easier to begin constructing a fantasy world than to bring it to completion. Although I do think, there have been many incredible completions. There is a sense that fantasies are maybe most engaging when, of course, the book is still in process, which means there is continual reveals of, let's say, another level at which the story is providing a perspective or deeper understanding of how what's unfolding is playing out, let's say, at the spiritual level or at the level of ideas. And the question for the fantasy author is, well, part of me is like, well, show me what you got at the level of providing some sort of meaningful, at least momentary and, interesting resolution to the war between the gods, or wars between the gods, however that's playing out. Because the story for the individuals, they come to an end. But it's very often the case that, well, what's more meaningful than those profound myths as we engage with them in story form? Often is the closing of the book and attending to the dishes, or attending to the tensions and realities in our actual lives. And so here I'm saying all of this to give an instance of the return of the reality that was always playing out in such a context and transcontextually, which was drive, which was that there was actually unbelievably, and to some degree, certainly speaking as a very limited human being, the learning available for us in story and myth is, warrants, to what degree is it inexhaustible is kind of the question. To what degree is the ecology of myth, and the ecology, speaking from a Jungian perspective, of the memory and we can say wisdom and capacity in the collective unconscious capable or sufficient to, well, we want to make distinctions between guidance and instantiation, or let's say actually some of the language you used, tarrying with, just really being in the process of relating to, struggling and building and creating and loving and losing, right? And loving and winning in the journey of our particular lives. And as you know, actually, and as a slight break here, which I shouldn't do from the perspective of people following along in the podcast, but I do think I was listening to your chat with OG. He was talking about the universal, particular, and the singular, and of course that's present in the book as well. I've been thinking a lot about the virtual, and also thinking about some of the white Hegelian language, the primordial nature of God and the consequent nature of God. And then, of course, you have, the concrescence between actual occasions, as we might say, the singularities of interaction, which are mediating the coming into potential of, you can say, the primordial nature of God into the consequent nature of God. And just from the way I've been reading some of these mappings, you could have the universal as the primordial nature of God and the particular as the consequent nature of God, and then the singular in terms of the actual concrescence. And so to incorporate the language of drive then in relation to this, we have demand, desire, drive. There's a sense of the invitation as a kind of guidance, but where that invitation as guidance sort of meets saying, here's the best I got in terms of just remember this, in terms of how my life has played out. I'm speaking from your perspective, but I'm also including myself in it to the degree I'm sort of articulating what you're saying fairly. That actually just remember, before the dust settles, after the dust settles, the return is not only a return to the wondrous or terrifying ways we can mythify and see the struggle and wonder of our lives, but is in a sense more imminent than that. The return is the real relationship to the unmapped participation in the where an ending meets a new beginning, somewhere in there, and those opportunities are always present for us in a sense. To add in one other piece, to connect back this notion of the living word. In my experience, cultivating and seeking to give life to and open the way for magic to occur in interaction, I noticed that staying too long in some presentation of some image as myth of what it is to encounter another, what it is to play a role, might be helpful to think this through structurally at some level. It does play an interesting role, but in actually attending to the relation I have to both knowing and not knowing, and attending to that process in someone else, there's always an open question. If there's not an open question around the myths we are living in the sense of our collaborative process, if we're building that kind of relationship in locating ourselves in myth rather than recapitulating myth, rather than recapitulating. But it's, there's a couple times I feel like I've broached making this really clear, but it does speak to the magic of the very confusion, the difficulty to name that I'm working with right now. the particularization of the living word is, and we've discussed this before, and it's not bindable. It's not finally enclosable in myth, in concept, as a complete
absolutely
package.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I see what you're saying. I see what you're pointing towards. I think it's very important. So, again, we have to think about myth and drive as a unity. But as with all these sort of dialectical unities, the way I understand them, is that there's kind of an asymmetrical tension internal to them. So myth and drive are a unity, but at the same time, in terms of how we experience the linearity of our being, myth breaks into drive in a way, right? Like myth builds up, cultivates, breaks into. Like I gave the example with the father-son. I create an environment for my son to learn about himself and the world through myth so that he can drive. Now, it's still non-orientable, not just linear, because the father has to embody the drive while cultivating the myth for the son. So it's both ways. And also the father is a son.
Right. It's both ways.
So it goes both ways. But at the same time, myth into the singularity of the drive is kind of the myth into the voice, to voice craft, the living word, that is not reducible to the myth. Right? It's emergent. The myth is a reduction to some emergence of the voice. So you do voice craft, and this year at the portal we've been doing a voice and nothing more. Now that's the radical far reaches in a way. Like we're not talking about myth at this point. We're talking about a voice and nothing more. The singularity of the voice in the abyssal drive, right? As an example. You mentioned the feeling of how great it feels to inhabit myth, right? You gave examples of Star Wars. Like, let's take Luke Skywalker and Darth Vader. Let's take watching Star Wars when we're a kid, right? I loved watching Star Wars as a kid. Some of my best memories, I remember just a memory coming to my mind of going to a drive-in to watch the new Star Wars. It's great to inhabit myth. We should always remember for example, Luke Skywalker and Darth Vader we're watching, in the myth itself, it's a catastrophic drama. Like, Luke is losing his hand, Darth Vader's fucking attacking him, like, they, going to the Death Star's blowing up, like, Darth Vader dies at the end, there's, he's it's a mess. It's a drama of drives. Right? And it's a mess, right? So we should always remember, you said, great to watch the movie or read the book. And then there's the dishes. Like you watch the movie and then your wife's like, you haven't done the dishes. You have the day-to-day. And this is, Zizek is great on this with love and marriage. That the transcendental beauty, the transcendental love is in the dirty laundry, the messy dishes, the day-to-day. That's why there's these images of Zizek sitting on a toilet, like in the philosopher pose. Like he's doing the classic philosopher pose on a toilet. That's why the cover of the book, to reference the cover of the book, I'm alluding to that, like directly. Just this coincidence between the deepest philosophical thinking and the day-to-day life, the most absolute mundane. The almost absolute mundane embarrassment of defecation. Like that's still how weird is that? Like the ultimate opposition, this capacity for the deepest philosophical cognition and the lowest animal defecation, urination. So one final thing I want to say just before passing it back to you, and I think that this is getting at what you were trying to point towards with the myth and the drive, and the myth as not totalizable or completely enclosable. For me, I had this conversation with, Michael Downs from the Dangerous Maybe blog, and he wrote the book Capital versus Time Energy. He's doing the Nick Land Zizek stuff.
I actually encountered his one of his podcasts the other week, and I've been thinking along similar lines. I do think there's something very important there. We return to that in a conversation about transhumanism for sure. Really, lots there.
Absolutely. So he's doing some really great philosophical thinking there, and I had this conversation with him because he was saying to me, Cadell, like, I know you and Zizek, he loves Zizek as well. Like, and he says, I know you and Zizek, you're doing the Christian atheism thing, but I can't do it. I can't do the Christianity thing because he's still burned from his childhood with Christianity. At the same time, he's all about lack, all about subjective destitution, goes to the lack conference and so forth. For me, everything is in understanding that the myth is pointing towards something concrete and singular, which you can't fetishize the myth to avoid. So many Christians will fetishize Christ, right? No, if you fetishize Christ, you don't understand Christ. If you're thinking that you looking at image of Christ and carrying a cross on your neck is understanding Christ, if you think going around telling people about Christ is understanding Christ, you missed it. You missed it. You treated the myth like a complete enclosure. What Christ is pointing towards is lack. What Christ is pointing towards is crucifixion. What Christ is pointing towards is your subjective destitution. You have to live that out. Then you get it. What God is pointing towards is my ego ideal of the big other. So you have to ask yourself, not do I believe in God, which is a ridiculous question. You have to ask yourself, what is my ego ideal? What is the big other that I live by? And how must that vanish? Right? I lived that out in my own way, which I could get into my own history with that, which is related to academia, which we probably talked about somewhere. Or Holy Spirit, for example, what is Holy Spirit pointing towards? Holy Spirit is pointing towards, how do I singularly engage in my network? Right? One of the reasons why we come together, you said one of the reasons why we've talked for the last 5 years or 4 years. It's about the singularity of our engagement with the network, about the ethics of how we engage the network, about how we engage the voice, about how we cultivate our relationship to philosophy and thinking our time. That's Holy Spirit. It's not about saying, I believe in God and Holy Spirit and I'm a Trinitarian and I use Trinitarian logic. No. Only insofar as the myth is pointing towards that. Do you get it? Again, and for the people who are treating myth as the total enclosure, by the way, this is the head spinning thing. In a way, the son has to treat myth as a total enclosure at a certain moment of his process. Has to. There's a way in which 19-year-olds and 18-year-olds in their coming into being, they have to do it. They can't not do it. Lacan calls this the non-duped heir. What does it mean, the non-duped heir? It means if you pretend you're not being duped, then you're in error. You have to be duped. You have to have a big other. You have to believe it, and it has to fall for you. Now, this could be, in my case, this could be the PhD supervisor, right? It could be my big other. which I believe in, which I sacrifice myself for, which I have my ego ideal oriented around, and then I'm duped. I have to go into the destitution of losing that.
Yeah, awesome. Okay. So if we take the necessity of the sun going through an enclosed myth, in effect, because for culture to reproduce itself, there must be, to use a Zach Stein term, teacherly authority. And the question, of course, that you ask in your work, or remind us to continue to come back to, is the reproduction of the social body in and among all of this, right, as being a key factor. Well, as we've discussed mentioned it in terms of demand and need, but that could also be framed as, and this is something Forrest Landry will use this framing to recognize that when we're born, we're not capable of making and instantiating any choices. We're not capable of, we have, instinct and what have you, but we're not capable of realizing our choices in the world. We have to be taught and supported into being able to do that. Need the parents to provide the food and all the rest of it. So how to go about actually making effective choices in the world. We begin without the wisdom. Now, we do come from a Jungian perspective, but also just from an evolutionary perspective, obviously. We come preloaded with a whole bunch of capacities which do come online with right nurturing. And so this is going to be important for the return to myth, which I want to bring to, in the very same way that we want to be careful. I was talking about at the beginning, if we don't understand the French Revolution, American Revolution, we're going to have certain repetitions. We also want to be careful about how much we've woken up to this myth or that myth straight into the dream of another myth. And so the active process of locating ourselves and relating, in praxis of relation with that, in the context of, the living word, you use a language of Holy Spirit, in that participating in creation together, being on the cusp of what is working, what is not working, all that kind of encounter is, I think, obviously becomes really, really critical. But if we say that to provide at least a semblance of sufficient education, of learning opportunity, to be able to activate our innate capacities to learn and function, obviously, with our biology, so as to be able to meet our needs and to participate in society and contribute to the process of change and renewal that is belonging, then myths are critical and are providing that kind of enclosure and provide, in a sense, inspiration, guidelines, limits, but also stories of what it means to transgress those limits, a whole bunch of stuff, right? That's encoding a lot of profound wisdom. But even in there, of course, in myths that encode particular orientations towards transgressing limits or rules, we have there myths that are including the myths of renewal of what structures society, which at one level is myth and is part of what we're participating in some sense, is wanting to understand just what myths, to bring in Jordan Peterson, just what myths are we playing out. And so the movement then from son into relating with the father, navigating that gap, what I want to sort of point out is the movement into caring about education in terms of, and it's not only this, we're sort of speaking about that, but in terms of the telling of story. What stories should we tell? What contexts for opening up to receive experience? How is it wise to create those? One of the chapters in the book, you speak about something that I've been in relation with for a number of years now. In fact, Peter Shosted was one of the first, podcast guests going back to, in fact, the end of 2017, I believe we recorded the first one. In that chapter, speaking about, the conceptual mediation of psychedelics. This is stuff I've spoken about with Cam at Voicecraft for hundreds of hours. And in fact, that chapter, I made a note there. One of the other myths of sort of structuring the direction of Voicecraft came through recognizing the inadequacies in psychedelic culture to actually conceptually mediate the experiences, obviously at a metaphysical level, but also and how to engage in dynamics of interaction in relation, but also, of course, economics and politics and all the rest of it, which is conditioning the whole context of interpretation of the various boundaries, all this stuff, right? So this was, an important part of also where our sort of journeys link up. So I'm pointing there to the context of psychedelics and opening to profound suggestibility as obviously very important teaching moments. Now, it's, a part of broader network conversations we're both involved in. The importance of story is often spoken about. I'll hear many people say, we've really just got to tell better stories in this time. What's the new story we can tell? Right. And this has been something I've explored on the podcast in a number of different ways, recognizing the criticality of story. Go back over the years, and a lot of the podcasts were to do with trying to understand the relationship between evolution and archetypes and how to conceptualize that. And the whole thing is about what does it mean to participate in transformation? But people think, well, what is that? What is the new story we can tell? But what it is to transmit story, what it is to participate in the reception of it, the relational praxis, the relations between father and son, perhaps concretely speaking, and this is what you're pointing to as a profound question for the future becoming of the networks we belong to. It is really a question of education and, reconstituting the social body. It's one thing for a set of fathers to speak eloquently and oftentimes extremely astutely, and it is profoundly valuable to articulate stories which could defend the legitimacy of our contact with a shared world. But the actual making of contact and the integrity of making contact and the challenge to relate with that as a coordination problem and supporting a praxis of engagement across the gaps where the mode of transmission, i.e., yes, rhetoric, but the relational fabric that constitutes the trust necessary for such an intimacy of transmission is not part of those stories, isn't, from what I see, part of what is actually being offered in any number of contexts. It's just a new story. Now, some of those stories are way more comprehensive than others, and we have profound amounts to learn from them. But this speaks to one of the great difficulties, and but the final thing I'll close with is that the drive I have to continue to relate with that phenomenon, I notice in some of the conversations you've had with OG, and also appears in the book, some of OG's language is, faithful presence. And you've also been using language of the patience of the concept, which, for me, if I simplify that, and there's more to it, if I simplify that, it's like some things take time and effort to try, and you actually have to keep on giving in order to see whether and how they might come to fruition and what their journey will be, and all of that. And there's certain faithful presence in relation.
I see voicecraft as a patient concept.
Totally. Very much. So I can relate very deeply to that. And I would just say to you, though, that those, if I'm being totally honest, I think I'd have to say that now what I might be able to embody could potentially, we could say, could stay closer to the truth of the drive. But what I'm left to say to someone wondering about the prospects of voicecraft, right? What I'm left saying looks something like a myth, a certain myth around the value of staying faithful. We can say to the drive, but it's this orientation toward greater than, or the beyond, or the becoming of creation, and the mutual participation, and that all these different things. It's this both ways that I don't know if I could ever locate a time where it would be appropriate for me to say, in an ultimate sense, drive before myth. Because as soon as I almost say that to myself and make the justification of it as an evaluation, affirmation, then I recognize the drive, you say, that creates the myths. My waking up into yet another myth, I find that I'm very careful about the humility of that. I know that's what you're stressing. And so is the invitation, the final question, the invitation is to make sure you're thinking drive before myth, but that fundamentally we can't actually ever step outside of things in an ultimate sense to approach it in a linear way.
We cannot get out of myth completely, ever. It's ultimately a non-orientable surface. Like the Mobius strip or the Klein bottle or the cross cap, however we want to think about a non-orientable geometry, it's not linear. Like once I've gone through myth, then I'm out of myth and I'm just in drive. So it's not like that. So the way I would say it is this, and also, real speculations is not for everyone. Real speculations is written in many ways for someone like you, or someone like Daniel, or the people that I'm referring to in the book, like the people who, like the projects and the people in the network that I cite. It's in many ways it's written for these people as well. It's also written for the people who get involved at Philosophy Portal, like so they have a deeper understanding of what's going on here. So I would say this: Voicecraft and Philosophy Portal are myths. But Voicecraft's myth is built on Tim Adalin's drive. Like it couldn't, like if your drive collapses, Voicecraft collapses.
Right. And I'm saying as well that the truth of my drive is inherently embedded in a continued process of relating with myth.
Absolutely. So they're inextricably linked. It's just that this book is written for the type of person that wants to actually create something like that is creating the next level of myth. Like again, I say Christ is not a Christian. That doesn't mean Christians are bad or Christians are wrong. It's just that Christ wasn't one. The people who followed Christ are Christians. They're in Christ's myth. Like they're in the wake of his drive. right? So it's both. It's both, and then we could do an analysis of one and the other. I'm specifically situating it also in what I think like it's also for the people in the network, but it's also for the universality of our moment, where I think we are trapped in myth and we don't understand drive yet. And we want to, like, the temptation is to find a myth that closes, that recloses. But no, that doesn't get at it. That doesn't get at it, because
can I say, just for the sake of my own clarity of understanding here, and to loop something back, thank you for the space. If we treated the myth, if we treated the myth as enclosable and consigned ourselves to closed myth, would that in effect be reverting back from Hegel to Kant, in a sense? Because then there's a kind of beyond, when we're not able to participate, we're kind of ignorantly unable to participate in what has the capacity to participate in the evolution of myth, or know ourselves to be doing that. There's creating a kind of, the myth becomes the barrier to a new noumenal, or something like this.
When we scapegoat postmodernism, usually what we're trying to scapegoat is the myths of the French structuralist milieu. When we scapegoat modernism, what we're mostly scapegoating is the result of Kant, the way modernity in many ways results in Kantian philosophy, as in many ways the pinnacle of liberal enlightenment. So, in a way, when we're trying to create new myths today, it depends on the group, it depends on the people. But many people I see who are scapegoating modernity, they're trying to create a myth of some structure that is pre-modern. Again, going back to the traditional Catholicism or the Orthodox Christianity, or there are other ways this can manifest as well. For example, Nietzsche, in many ways, was romanticizing Rome and saying that Romanization was actually the correct path, not Christianity. So there's a way in which MAGA is a myth. Make America Great Again is a myth, right? Which is obfuscating Trump's drive, right? So it's very complex, right? But there is a temptation. Here's the thing, and this is a key to Hegel's phenomenology. At every level of the phenomenological structure, there is a temptation to closure. You can be tempted to close on reason. You could be tempted to close on self-consciousness. That would be just narcissism. There's a temptation to close on spirit. That would be the kind of unreflective spiritual communities that scapegoat religion. There's a temptation to close on religion, right? And then there's a temptation to close on politics. You could argue that the hegemony, like I think what people call, correct me if I'm wrong, but people call the blue church, or is it the red church? The blue church.
Blue church and red religion.
Blue church and red religion, right? So there's the blue church is the closure on liberal democracy or woke politics or something. So these closures appear at various levels, is what I'm saying. It's hard to stay open. You asked, what stories are we telling? There's different levels here, right? Because I want to think about this on the level of singularity and on the level of universality. So on the level of the stories we're telling as singularity, this is why drive is so important. Because in many ways, if you're just attentive to your drive, And if you're speaking truly about your drive, then the story writes itself, right? So for me, like in many ways, Real Speculations is the story writing itself. Meaning, I'm just writing about the people and the different organizations that I'm collaborating with. There's chapters about Peter Rollins, or there's chapters about the conversation I had with Peter Shosted Hughes, or there's chapters on some of the belonging again stuff with O.G. Rose, or, there's chapters of places where I've had conversations with you or Layman and so forth. So that's just me telling my story and embedding it in the larger context of my drive. And then there is the question of the universal story. There's the question of the grand narrative, which, of course, postmodernity in many ways says we're beyond in some way. There is a way in which I see the last really big attempt to come up with a grand story is in Marxism, which does offer a story which is trying to approach the highest levels of political economy. For me, whatever grand story or universal story that we articulate for our moment, I just think it has to have the Marxist stress test, meaning it doesn't have to be Marxist. It doesn't. But it has to approach the real problems of political economy. If it doesn't, if it actively avoids the problems of political economy on the universal level, then to me it's insufficient. That's what I would call the stress test of Marxism. So I'm not saying we have to do the Marx story, but we have to take up that problem. That's why one of the reasons I follow the work of Marxist theorist Chris Catrone is because he frames Marxism as a question for us. He frames Marxism as a problem for us. He doesn't frame Marxism as the story that we need to identify with. He says, this is the problem. This is the question for us. So, for example, I just recently had a conversation on the channel with Mladen Dollar, who's one of the crucial theorists in the Ljubljana school of Zizek, Zupancic, and Dollar. And in that conversation, I was trying to get at the prehistory of the Ljubljana school. I was trying to ask, what were you guys struggling with? What were you guys thinking before Zizek became Zizek? And he said, we were struggling with the French structuralist milieu. The problem was, here's the problem. The French structuralist milieu was producing great text after great text after great text. Lacan, Althusser, Derrida, Foucault, Deleuze. It was just text after text after text. And the problem is that no one knew how to make sense of the story of all this. It was too complex. So the dominant response to this complexity was that there's no more grand narrative. That was Lyotard. So, but what the Ljubljana school was doing, they were saying, no, there's a story here. It's just the story is so complex, no one's made sense of it yet. And I could go into what the Ljubljana school's story is and how they articulate a grand narrative. It has a lot to do with something like no Marxism without psychoanalysis. That would be the start of their story. It's two things, actually. No Marxism without psychoanalysis. So here, thinking about the unconscious is structured by a language. The singularity of subjectivity cannot be overdetermined by a command economy or a control economy. Also, no Marxism without Marxist prehistory, meaning not only Hegel, but the Protestant Reformation. That's the theopolitical. Because here's crucial, what people don't realize, and this is very clear when you read the early Marx. Marx thinks the proletarian revolution is a continuation of the Protestant Reformation. That really has to sink in because it's the theopolitical. Marx is saying the Protestant Reformation was the precondition for proletarian revolution. So what might that help us think with regards to the Russian Revolution? It might make us think, oh shit, it was the wrong theological ground. The Russian population had not been through a Protestant Reformation. The Russian population was still an Orthodox peasantry. It was not the right theological ground. What about China? Their theological ground was Confucian. All of these questions have not been approached by Marxist theory. It's totally off. The whole theopolitical foundation is rotten. So, what I'm trying to say is, if we want to look to the singularity of story, all we have to do is tell the story of our drive. And we have to constantly resublate the story of our drive as we go with each other. Then the question of the universal story, it has to recapitulate our actual history with modernity and postmodernity, and it cannot scapegoat those things. It has to work with those things in all their complexity because of the political economy, because of the singularity of subjectivity, because of going back is not an answer for the future. It's a part of the story. It'll always be a part of the story, but it can't be the answer going forward. I do take this to be, if we're going to Iron Man it, like this is what the people thinking through metamodernity are trying to do as well. The people trying to work through metamodernity are trying in this direction as well. So there is a fidelity and an alliance and a similar shared value there. It's just a question of what are our methods for approaching that and how do we signify that? And are we talking about the same thing?
Yeah, that was awesome, Cadell. And in terms of synergies or similarities, before there can be synergies in this case with, let's say, the specifically more meta modernity context, I do wonder about the different modes of relation or affects of relation that result by virtue of different approaches as well. I think that's definitely something we see. There's definitely differences in vibe among different philosophical communities, and that's something I'm particularly interested in, and maybe something we can return to. There's so much in what you said, which is really, 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 really interesting and points to, ongoing work by the sounds of things. And a couple thoughts which came to mind, which are, one is to loop back in Jordan Peterson. There's a sense in which he is saying there's not enough psychoanalysis in Marx. Now, he's saying it in a way that is not open to thinking with the whole context of political economy. As you say, it is remarkable how much, Maps of Meaning, and I respect that book. I respect it in big part because serious drive went into that book. Okay, like this was serious drive that went into that book, and it's remarkable how basically totally absent by comparison Peterson's effort to articulate the story of his drive in relation to political economy is relative to his investigation of the psychoanalysis of human beings and culture as such, as understood through different political historic moments, for sure, but focusing, very much on the nature of violence and also the structure of phenomenological perception from his perspective, in relation there, and how we update our maps and all of that, and what conditions are seeing. It is totally remarkable how little he has applied that same drive toward understanding to these other domains. And yet he's recognizing, in a sense, from a different angle, the same sort of problem. The other thing I want to say is, just for the sake of just clarifying again the utilization of drive in some of my own language and things I'll often say. So I think about the relationship between education, contribution, and belonging as a triadic structure. To think about the cultivation of culture and, its sicknesses and its regenerative capacities. And one of the ways, if I would apply the language of drive, is as a cultivated drive is a cultivated drive toward contribution as such, contribution to the context of one's belonging, where that belonging is, from my perspective, not to be seen through some immutable enclosed myth, but something that is subject to change. And so the question for parents and elders of society very much becomes, well, how to support the learning and education so as, for the children, for people to learn how to contribute to that context of belonging, but also to equip them with the transgressive capacities to contribute to the reordering of the social body as well, of belonging. And so from the way we've been, as you demand, desire, drive, demand could be seen then as sort of those, beginning in that more infantile necessity of satisfying what the children require, basically kind of like satisfying the baseline requirements of belonging that are sort of non-negotiables for the culture. And these are obviously conditioned and constrained by different levels of ontology as well. And then desire, in its, let's say, less mature form, is going to look like the pursuit of images of what it means to contribute to particular myths of what it means to belong, which can remain regressed at, even as you were describing, at that self-conscious level of narcissism, where that sense of belonging, like that desire to continue what is felt to be the authentic movement or need for touch or connection or feedback or something like that with the external, is blinded and narrowed and solipsistic in that way. And then we could also see desire in its still maturing form as being wed to the kinds of contribution that are not well, it's fractal, isn't it? And that's the thing. It's fractal, and what we're learning different things at different times, and there is a time absolutely to be a teenager and a man within particular myths, and the lessons we are learning and the capacities and relational capacities we're cultivating in there, and the different relationships we have, intimate relationships, and the stages of those relationships and the learnings and whatever. So there is that sense in which there's that desire drive that it's playing out there at multiple levels, as we've discussed. But then, ultimately, if we incorporate, and your movement was to open up into relating to the universal in terms of the world historical progression of culture, how we conceptualize identity and how we play out the mediation of identity in relation to other in the world, the eternal question of philosophy then is at least in part to do with the ongoing understanding of actually what it means to contribute to belonging, what it actually means to live out one's drive, and to pay attention to the way in which one's drive and our collective drive is being mythified, as signal to reorient which way we're driving for the time that we are in fact at the wheel of life, right? Like, that's the thing. There is not the only other thing I'll just say is that there does seem to me to be something really valuable and perhaps ultimate about the notion of accepting one's hill to die on. And in a sense that is kind of like maybe the theopolitical real, or something like that one is a subject of a particular moment in time. And there are, the invitations we make and the relationships we build and the conflict and the combat that comes to our door, or that which we feel is the contentions we need to take into the world, the authority worthy of challenging. In a sense, there is a kind of there's a kind of an affirmative move of consigning oneself, accepting one's mythification, and in a sense, without doing so, there wouldn't be the stability to lay down, that next level, and as well to recapitulate, it's not just all new, obviously, of education. So there's a sense in which the father then, the son in becoming the father, the vanishing is so tricky. We were speaking about this in a network session the other day with Forrest. There's a desire in a sense to give a gift to the future, but all these acts of communication are in their own way, like they participate in the shaping, and so a desire to enable choice, it's one of Forrest's phrases, love is that which enables choice. And certainly I like to approach love in many different angles, but there's something very helpful about that statement, very profound about that. There is, the memory and teaching and the retroactive relationship with the father continues. I do believe that we all vanish, in some ultimate sense. And yet and at the same time, I don't, because we cannot but form part of the living history of the particularity in the Hegelian language of the becoming of spirit, if I'm using that appropriately, but from the Whiteheadian sense, and where I usually am in relation to, and how that links up with Jung in terms of what is conditioning the memory of our organism, that there is a very real sense in which death is not the end, in that we cannot but participate in what conditions what comes next, and we might wish to enable as much as possible, and yet we are authorship seems foundational to creativity, and again, how we hold that is obviously super key. What it is to be a medium and channel and these sorts of things, but the interpretation and the poeticization, is as much a part of all of this. And that's a kind of maybe a separate point in some way. I could give another go at recapitulating that to bring out some final clarity, but it's probably all contained in there and what I feel sort of drawn to just share in closing here. And there is, again, there is something, there is a self-consciousness to Jordan Peterson relative to Harris and Dawkins that I see in that acknowledgement of choosing one's hill to die on. We might rightly question, like, why that one? Like, do you want to maybe walk across to another hill? But there is, I think, part of the real vibrancy and the struggle of Peterson is that he really is like choosing to die on a hill. And I think he goes through the negativity of that. And there seem some absurdities to the particular sufferings he's experiencing in relation there. But at the same time, it is interesting. I think you do a fair, a steel manning of how you see his work in the book. But this is why the project, the Voicecraft project, and the broader effort of cultivating a philosophical milieu and just a cultural, relational milieu that can think and feel, right, has this, I think, part of the myth, at least as it's been for me, that I've been telling. And in a separate conversation we can discuss the various ways that I've encountered severe resistance and struggle and failure along the way of this. But part of the myth is, again, this desire to participate in the cultivation of contexts that can support and enable the living word, yes, to engage in a kind of rational mediation. There were some other terms you gave in the book you put alongside rational mediation aspects, which are, I think maybe it was the sexual and the political economic kinds of things that one might rightly question whether can be mediated transformatively in conversation.
Right.
And I think that's fair. But I also think that, a conversation which takes place in a context in which, relationships are cultivating the kind of trust that can bring some of these dynamics into conversation is then sort of an enriched conversation about some of these dynamics. And so thinking through at that level, we are speaking about conversation just at a very much broader existential level of cultivating relationship. First and foremost, before we're speaking about or alongside the process of, let's say, rational mediation. Certainly there's limitations to discourse if it doesn't also, to use some of the OG Rose language we were speaking about in the session today, but you've spoken about in conversations with him, rhetoric, which, really just an artfulness of cultivating relationship. And that, and there's plenty that the spirit can bring to that, some of these, spiritual contexts. So it takes all sorts. That's the thing. It really does take all sorts, a philosophy that can be open properly to all the various different ways that expression, voice can presence through different instrumentation, right? Not just philosophical discourse, and yet which that context can also appreciate the importance of philosophical discourse. That's part of the myth, and much more to say on that in terms of what some of the successes have been and what some of the challenges have been. But through it all, I am feeling a strengthening of capacity for all of that among some people. And I think the orientation toward philosophical projects or projects in the world that are remembering who they're actually in conversation with as they relate to the world historical and universal, which I think is also something we share as what has been nutrifying of the drive. I will say that it's. I said this in a session this morning. The final thing I'll say is just that one of the most reliable ways I've found to rejuvenate efforts toward contribution in the world when I'm in doubt about my own capacities, value, and are experiencing lack in that way through real encounter, obviously with things not always working out, is just recognizing the people who bring so much to the fields I'm a part of, and I ask what energy, like what water can I share with them? In what ways can I support their creative becoming? And can say that way more simply. What good have I experienced, and how can I give more to that? Or what beauty or whatever as well, right? And I find that is one of the most reliable ways to stay moving in a productive way. And and for other reasons as well, I'm motivated to engage with your work. And part of what has been my effort in engaging with this work is recognizing the tremendous quality you're bringing and, educational affordances you're bringing. And thank you for that. So I hope that this was, interesting for people and can help to strengthen some of the connection between different ways of languaging and approaching some of the challenges of, relating and building and perceiving the world that we're part of. So if you'd like to say anything in closing, Cadell, and please feel free to take your time.
Yeah, no, a lot to say. But I really appreciate you holding this space. I feel like it's been really generative, and I feel like we've gone to some really interesting places. Many of those places are directly things related to the Real Speculations book, and some of those places represent more where my thought is right now. But I just want to say, in the context of you engaging my work, you were involved in you gave a great review and reading of Systems and Subjects, and then you were involved in a discussion about that. And I recall that you said something like, recognizing the importance of systems and subjects, but then at the same time saying something feels missing or something feels incomplete. By definition, there must always be something missing and incomplete. But in many ways, what Real Speculations is situated in what I think you were pointing towards as that something missing, because Systems and Subjects was about basically a meta dialectics of interdisciplinary science and continental philosophy. So I felt like the interdisciplinary science was needed to get outside of specialized disciplines, thinking in terms of systems more broadly. But then the conversation about continental philosophy was bringing in the subjective. And then what would that conversation look like? I think in many ways, Real Speculations is about embedding that philosophy of subjectivity into a real para-academic network, or we might call it underground theory, or we might call it liminal web, or whatever we call it. I don't really have a strong preference. It's just there's some network that we're a part of, and the work is for people who are a part of that network. So I mean, if that's you, I mean, this is what this book is oriented towards. You made references to Peterson and Marx, and I do think that that's a super interesting thing to think. You were saying that Peterson's kind of picked a hill to die on. I think in many ways that hill is kind of like the necessity of a return to Judeo-Christian values and a kind of, again, juxtaposing that, let's say, in relationship to what he calls postmodern neo-Marxism. Now, where I say my intervention is located, not just real speculations, but my drive in general, is when people talk about Marx, when Peterson talks about Marx, what they're really talking about is Stalinist terror. That's really what they're talking about. They're not talking about Marx, actually, which is the problem. They're talking about we don't want to go back to the communist command economy, and we don't want to go back to the gulags, and we don't want to go back to the collectivization process, right? Which is totally fair. Like I'm with you. And at the same time, when we're thinking about these questions of returning to Judeo-Christian values or the postmodern neo-Marxism, it is at the end of the day the question of which way are we driving? Like, which way are we going? And, downstream of the return to Judeo-Christian values, you are going to see the emergence of a politics, which I think finds its most coherent home with a form of right-wing populism. In many ways, in the UK, I've been paying attention to the UK very intensely, that's probably where we're headed. Like, we're probably headed to a form of right-wing populism. We're probably headed to a reform. And what does that mean? Well, I was listening to Carl Benjamin Sargon of Akkad recently, and he said, the way we're currently driving, his words, the way we're currently driving is towards a country which is open to endless immigration. We're just getting, from his language, he said, we're just getting swamped. And his supporting of reform, and even further than that, is he said, we need to drive towards a country that solidifies its identity. Britain is for British. Britain for British people. He says, Pakistan is for Pakistanis, India is for Indians, Nigeria is for Nigerians, and Britain is for British people. Right? Now, the question is, when it comes to this form, which I do think is downstream of the Judeo-Christian values return thing, is that Marxism in its theoretical core is saying that, because what right-wing populism is National Socialism. Like, that's what it is. It's it's socialism for the nation. Right? So what Marxism is basically saying is that's not going to work because capital is global. Like, you think immigration is the reason. Well, you think immigration is being driven by capitalist forces. Correct. Your solution is to not take up the problem of global capital. Your solution is to go back to a form of national ethnic identification. It's not going to work. So you can do it. We can go there. Looks like we are going there. But ultimately, the specter of Marx, like some leftists will say, or Marxists will say, the specter of Marxism is haunting Europe. It's hanging. It's still going to be there. The specter will still be there, like the dead father. And what is it? What is it? Very simply. So I'll try and articulate it. It is taking up the politics of the antagonism between capital and labor. That's what it is. It's taking up the politics of that antagonism. There's an antagonism there. What's the antagonism? It's that capital doesn't track my labor, and labor is not tracking with capital. They don't track. There's a contradiction at the heart of capital and labor. We don't know what to do about it. Now, there's two dreams in this contradiction, which are very relevant for us to think. The first is the dream of capital. So I'm going to tell the dream of capital, and I'm going to say the dream of labor. The dream of capital is, funny enough, universal basic income. Why is that the dream of capital? It's the dream of capital because you have the smooth running of capital without having to worry about labor. In other words, you can just have the flows of money without worrying about the people's labor. The people are just all on benefits. People are just all on social security of some kind, some benefits of some kind, because there's not enough labor for them. And then there's a culture that is that I'm not going to work, not going to be in labor. Right? So that's the dream of capital. Now you see that emerge among the tech CEOs of the AI, because the tech CEOs of the AI, they're just in the dream of capital. And AI, and this is Mikey Downs' work, the dream of capital is AI. It's automation.
Yeah.
What are you automating? You're automating labor, right? So that's the one side. That's the dream of capital.
Well, deeper, it's also relationality. There's something about this which I think, from the techno-feudal perspective, recognizing the alienation and bringing in attention, I think, is really important in terms of the way that our care relationships have also been commoditized and will become more commoditized as more traditional labor continues to be automated. And so the alienation of the relations between each other is part of the continuation of the truth of that, I said before, the truth of capitalism as unemployment. It is that alienation from participating in relationality as such, like being in touch with what actually contributes to the conditions of one's belonging. And through the techno-feudal project, the saturation of bullshit, and you speak about this very well in the book in terms of the autoerotic loops and the immediacy of gratification of the digital and the screens and what have you, and we can see that as parasitic on the possibility for learning, taking in information about the world and relating in the manners we've been speaking about. But please.
Well, in the context of you saying that the truth of capitalism is unemployment, so that's why I'm saying, if the truth of capital is unemployment, then the dream of capital is universal basic income. Right?
Yeah, absolutely.
It's the truth of capital is unemployment, right? And that's been the problem. That's been the tension, and that goes back to the origin of all these ideas. So what's the dream of labor? The dream of labor is the smooth running of my work without having to worry about capital. Meaning I can do my work at Philosophy Portal, I can do my philosophical drive, and I don't have to worry about capital. Like I'm just doing the work in some pure productivity. Right? Now, this is actually the dream of you could argue this is the dream of the communists. Like, the communists are basically, like, the way, and sometimes it's framed, is that you just have pure productive work, universal communist productivity, without having to worry about its connection to capital or capital accumulation. Right? So you have these dreams, right, but the crucial thing, and this is the psychoanalysis, no Marxism without psychoanalysis, because what is psychoanalysis? Psychoanalysis is the analysis of dreams. So you have these dreams, right? Well, the thing is that what we're avoiding is the antagonism as such. Working with the antagonism of capital and labor. We don't want to touch it. We don't know how to do it. That's all politics is responding to it in various ways. So the problem is that if you don't take up this challenge, I think Peterson is an example, you get stuck in the culture war. You just get stuck in the culture war. So, like, for Peterson, he's in opposition to liberalism. And the result is not a sublation of liberalism. Like, let me give a concrete political example. Like, Peterson absolutely hates the Canadian Liberal Party. He hates them. He hates them. But the Liberal Party just won again. Why? Because of Trump. That's literally why they won. The Liberal Party was not going to win. I even told Zizek. Zizek asked me privately. He said, "Is the Canadian Liberal Party, does it have any chance?" My response to him at the time, this was before the reaction to Trump, I said, it looks like there's no chance. It was like for sure Canada was going to go right wing. But they didn't. And it was because of Trump saying he's going to own Canada. Like as soon as Trump said he was going to own Canada, the Liberal Party just soared. They just came out of nowhere and won. And Peterson hates that. So my point is that if we're not taking the capital labor thing seriously, and if we're going to go to the National Socialism thing, which is the right-wing populism thing, it's just going to make the problem worse. And it's going to get deeper, and it's going to get deeper, and it's going to get deeper. So you were talking about belonging and change. And there's a contradiction there as well, because usually we associate belonging with fixed categories. Usually we associate belonging with a permanent being. This is in many ways the challenge that Hegel presents before us, because for him, absolute knowing is a becoming other to itself. Hegel thinks that we are belonging in the pure becoming.
And on this, I just say there's a beautiful wordplay with belonging, which is belonging. So it's interesting how there's an inherent, it speaks to exactly what you're pointing to in a sense, that wordplay.
Yeah. But it's a huge challenge. We don't know how to think about it. For me, it has to do with, just here referencing, Hegel has these great passages about how pure spiritual becoming is found in death itself. And this is not like the death at the end of your life, but like actually the death which we find in this life. But we don't want that. And who doesn't want that? Liberal hedonism. Liberal hedonism doesn't want that, right? So the challenge there is it's right there. It's right there, right before us. Are we going to recognize the value of what we've won with liberalism? Are we going to cultivate a responsibility for ourselves on the highest level so that we can go to a higher level with each other? Or are we going to have these reactionary turns which will repeat and they'll repeat and they'll repeat and they'll repeat on the level of the demand, the desire, and the drive thing and the dead dream of socialism? The demand would be the basic needs, right? And that's always been the dream of socialism, that you have the basic needs foundation, right? Now, the desire thing, oftentimes the problem with socialists is that they scapegoat capitalism. That's one of the things I got rid out of my system back in 2017. I told myself in 2017, you got to learn small business. You gotta. The problem with most leftists is that they scapegoat business in general, and they don't bother learning small business, because I'll tell you what, small business is not the problem. Commodities that serve community. Here's the thing. Commodities that serve communities, which I take Philosophy Portal and Voicecraft to be, commodities that serve communities are not the problem. They're part of the solution. And what are they doing? We don't have our foundation of basic needs, you and I, right? So, because we don't live in socialism. We live in capitalism. But what the small businesses and the commodities serving communities is doing is mediating the structures of desire. It is a certain myth. It is the realm of myth. Like we talked about, Voicecraft is a myth. Philosophy Portal is a myth. It's dependent on a drive, though. So then the drive is the leaders of community. The paradox is that the subject of drive doesn't actually need community, but community needs the subject of drive. Community can't exist without the subject of drive. It will fall. Why? Why is that? Because the community without the subject of drive, it will eat itself. it will kill itself. It will be eaten by its own desire. That's why you need the subjective drive. So I'll just say one final thing, and then we'll use that as a closing thought. I know in your community and I know in your work, there's probably this, and I'm not against it at all. There's this tendency comes from, I think, Vervaeke, of dialectic to dialogos.
I was hoping we would get to this. That's the right move to make. That's the only other thing which I remember. There was part when we transitioned from the first segment into the second. What I slipped was this angle. So I'm very glad you're bringing this up.
I've been thinking. So in many ways, I'm saying something similar in Real Speculations, because I'm saying dialectic is not in and of itself. It's just not an end in itself. Just like myth is not an end in itself. Dialectic is not an end in itself. I'm saying that its end is real speculations, which you could say is the very, core of dialogos. So at the same time, I think there's this non-orientableness and the unity of dialectic and dialogos, that it goes both ways in a way. So what I'm going to say is that I think that if the definition of dialogos is getting somewhere that you cannot just go by yourself, like getting somewhere in a conversation that you couldn't just have gotten there by yourself, it has to be in the dialogos, then I think the problem I have, and now this problem is coming from my real experience with men's circles, because I did dialogos. Like my original impetus leaving academia was doing a dialogos that resulted in a book called Sex, Masculinity, God, which was a trialogue. It's just a dialogos. Is that dialogos itself breaks open into dialectical levels of where the dialogos is situated. So like where I was doing the Sex, Masculinity, God was in the men's circle, men's work. Here's what I'll say, is that dialogos cannot just be an abstract circling. Like just let's get together and circle. Right?
Absolutely.
My two levels, and this is related to your provocation with the libidinal economy thing, which is a big part of the argument for the Lacanian stuff in the Real Speculations book, that the libidinal economy has two, to my mind, where we should practice dialogos if we're serious. It's in the context of you and your intimate partner. That's the first level. Dialogos with you and your intimate partner. And dialogos with you and we can say business partners, we can say creative collaborators, like collaboration and network that involves money. Like I'll say, one of my best friends, she did the cover for Real Speculations. She's one of my best friends. It was hard to talk about money. Like, you do this cover, you're a professional illustrator, professional animator. How much for the cover, for your labor, the capital labor antagonism. You have labor time to make this cover. How much is it worth in capitalist terms? How much do I pay? Versus how much does the book make me? How much can I afford to pay you for this work? These conversations are difficult, right? For best friends, it's difficult. For best friends, it could break friendships. Now, you didn't value my labor time, or you want me to pay for this, where you should be my friend. You should want to help me just for the sake of helping this project. Can't you see my vision? Can't you see why this is more important than any money? All these things. This is where dialogos really has its meat in the real. Its teeth in the real, sorry. With the intimate partner, with the practical business relationships, with the practical collaboration relationships, this is where it becomes real, because sometimes reason alone can't get there. There are these there are these things that lead us to the truth of our unconscious and lead us to the truth of our social being in the
Right.
deepest way. So I'll just end there, but I really appreciate you taking the time for this.
Yeah, awesome. Well, I would just love to respond there, just to take that thought on as well, and also clarify some things, just for the sake of how that I see the myth of voicecraft and how at least I narrativize that. In terms of the term dialogos, it's never been something that It's difficult because obviously I have a lot of respect for John Vervaeke and others who appreciate the qualities and the usage of the term. I never liked the term. I actually remember I spoke to Chris Mastro Pietro many years ago now, around the time that was coined, and I basically said to him that and Chris Mastro Pietro, being a close collaborator of John Vervaeke, basically said to him, something to the effect of, I guess whatever the spirit of the living word and creative relationality and the value of really communication, whatever it is we're making of that, I don't wish to, I won't be speaking that or naming that as dialogos. What I will say is that, again, we could defend the etymology of it and break down of it in terms of, is it dia? It's like through. It's like through logos.
It's a fancy way of saying conversation.
Totally, and that was always what it was to me. And so I
well, you say conversation craft, no?
No.
Or no? No, okay. No. That's TLC. TLC says conversation craft.
I've actually always resisted naming whatever the whole point, in a sense, is like, it's not. And the thing, I like the categories you gave, and I will complete that thought by saying this. Well, for me, voicecraft is in service to that, the qualities of speech, of if I use words like the transmutation of perception into expression, right, as part of a mutual, like a bunch of abstract language. There's, I share the same spirit of care for the art form that is philosophy. Ultimately, is philosophy. It's communication. It's life. I don't give a fuck. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's not.
Sure.
I want to follow up on.
Yeah.
In terms of the intimate partnerships and then business relations, I can give a concrete example of when, a few of my closest friends and creative collaborators and intimate partner were all going through the process of maybe moving in together, and people's lives were to some degree on hold. How are we going to? Someone's
that's a whole mess.
Leases. Well, yeah, it can be.
Yeah,
and it can become more of a mess.
And
in the end, Taryn and I chose, and I will say that it was, largely my drive, which was making the determination of what the perception of my needs were, that was not the right way to go, but
good. You were being a good traditional patriarchal leader, and just joking.
Well, but there's obviously a truth to it. Is that actually in terms of my role in that context, there came a time where there was a moment that was quite clear about stepping up to, engage that process, and it's all good. So, and there was also different aspects to that, but you can see these in all different contexts, in football contexts. So I would say there's many contexts in which whatever it is you were naming as dialogos has its place.
Yeah.
And
I was just pointing at like two ones that I think are of particular value, but there's way more.
Yeah. And I love the point, the dialogos into dialectic, and then the dialectic into dialogos.
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, I
It
absolutely
might be
agree.
similar to the myth drive thing. Like you have to think both of them and
Absolutely. And for
the
me,
relation.
the way I relate, I feel I've always been in that, whatever that tension and relation is, has always felt deeply natural to me. So, and I'm not really hung up on, like, I grew up absolutely loving an argument. Do you know what I mean? Like,
There you go.
it's no issues with that.
Yeah.
But I tell you what, but I also, I grew up with just a few experiences of, conversations that opened the way for really deepening understanding, where the heart was present and the depths of seeking was present and profound wisdom came through in a way that, cultivated my connection, for example, to my father, to my grandfather, uh, among my friends. And yeah, so, you know, all of it. I'm interested in all of it. And, and I suppose the only other thing I'll say, just in the context of pointing to a further conversation, but in the context of thinking the cultivation of networks, attention, um, time energy lack, which I know is part of, the conversational context. I think it's a helpful concept. I feel like I was always just saying time and energy before then. I appreciate it's being thought in a particular way, but I find that one hard because it's literally written as Tim energy, and I'm too
Yeah.
egotistical to be able to read it as time energy. So I find it really
Right.
disjunctive.
In
Anyway,
in
but
Mar- in Marxism, it's really just pointing towards the labor side of the equation. Like when we
right,
think about
totally.
getting our time energy, like it's just talking about our labor, really.
Uh, yeah,
Our, la- our
I get it.
Traditionally, it's just called labor time.
Yeah, well, I suppose the thing is that it's also the energy we have for a transformative relational process, which
Yes,
is
that's
kind
why
of
it's
the kind
yeah,
of labor that we have to do in
yeah,
this new paradigm. And so,
yeah,
I would just say on that point, um, the relating with all these concepts, and the world historical progression of philosophy and all these different things, and being able to think contradiction and all this kind of thing. Obviously, like, I value that like tremendously, and I honor that, and I will always desire to create context to honor that. One of the things in voicecraft that is very much part of the fabric is recognition of a certain quality that we can bring to the field, which supports the mutual working with contradiction and difference that does not necessarily require, you know, individuated capacities to reckon and work with the profound contradictions as could then be applied to the world historical stage with the kind of teacherly authority that performs a particular critical function in the mode of broadcast expression to various networks. And so there's a way of kind of one of the ongoing challenges I see, and I really notice in the context of opening up and cultivating networks, where that even though philosophy is, like a treasured part of what it is consistently wanting to try and welcome people who might not have, obviously, a depth of formal philosophical education, and for whom their path is not to go on a depth of formal philosophical education for any number of reasons, right? But who have other qualities to bring, and who can
I
certainly
love that.
participate in the transformation of understanding, and in oftentimes can be at
Absolutely.
an embodied level, even conceptual level, very much more advanced than others who are engaging things conceptually. I mean, and
Sure.
so these dynamics, and how to create the kinds of social contexts and modes of participation in communication writ large, is remains of massive interest, and is super super challenging. And it is something I'm just noting there is like, very interesting further conversation and, sharing of ideas and experiments in relation. Because, Jesus Christ, there's just so many different negativities that are encountered along the way of this journey of, do I provide value to this context? What is my value in relation? Being able to recognize the value that others are bringing, being able to recognize different dimensions of contribution. Very much not easy, particularly when, as you know, in a conversation between you and I, with philosophy being such a great love and calling, it's like, yeah, of course, we see a lot of the lacks of culture in terms of philosophy, which is true, and so but that is the truth of, if I can use the language, is the truth of my drive. And so it's very interesting, the relationship between like the truth of my drive and, I say, the truth of my curiosity and what lights me up more reliably, recognizing the partiality of that with respect to the broader efforts at culture building is one of the continued challenges, and really watching how much of that I can bring of myself in different contexts, because, sometimes one insight is too much, let alone 10, right? It's just as a silly thing to say. So all these dynamics of navigating energy and context of reception, all of this is really present for me in and among this effort toward cultivating the kind of, sharing in subjectivity and community that can actually reckon with the tensions that we're bringing to, and you are bringing so excellently well, to conceptual mediation. So thank you for that, Cadell. We bring it to an end here, eh?
My pleasure, Tim. Thanks so much.